The views and opinions expressed by tonight's guest and topic of discussion do not necessarily represent the official policy or position of Spaced Out Radio, Spaced Out Weekend, Spaced Out Radio Limited, its hosts, syndicated carriers, or anyone associated with this broadcast. Any rebroadcast, reproduction, or other use of this broadcast or podcast without the express written consent of Spaced Out Radio or Spaced Out Radio Limited is strictly prohibited. Listener discretion is advised.
BUMBLEFOOT. BUMBLEFOOT.
Are you experienced?
Stop right there!
From high atop the mountains of British Columbia to you listening around the world, this is Spaced Out Radio with host Dave Scott.
They let us play with all our toys. They let us think that we're big boys. They let us make the louder noise, but we ain't rule the world. They let us think we're Superman.
You can follow us on our website, spacedoutradio.com, on iTunes and TuneIn. Follow Dave on Twitter at Spaced Out Radio, on Facebook at Spaced Out Radio Show, or on our YouTube channel, Spaced Out Radio Show.
I try to act so cool, but you know I'm just a fool for you. I will stop till I reach the top just to be there with you.
Dave, oh Dave, are you playing with Bigfoot and aliens again?
Dad, you gotta stop haunting the ghost. It's scaring them.
All right, seriously, put down the pointy sticks.
Oh, the deeper I fall.
Okay! Game on! Game on!
The password is...
All right.
Buckle up, space travelers. It's time to go for a ride on Spaced Out Radio. Mr. Bumblefoot, Dave is ready for liftoff.
I try to act so cool, but you know I'm just a fool for you.
Seriously, Dave? Really? Aren't you a little old for a tinfoil hat?
Hello, Toby. Bye-bye. Love you. Bye-bye.
Please take your seat above all. There will be a prepare for takeoff. Start. 2, 1. Boost ignition and liftoff.
I'm such a lucky guy, 'cause after all this time, it's like the deeper I go, the deeper I fall. The deeper I go, the deeper I fall.
Good evening and welcome to Spaced Out Radio tonight. I am your host, Dave Scott. It's good to have you along for the ride on this Tuesday, June 27th. Wednesday, June 28th. If you're on the East Coast or across the pond, hope you have a great morning, day, and night. We are live right here in the Great White North on top of the mountains of central British Columbia as we are here for you 7 days a week. We welcome in everyone listening in on our terrestrial stations, WQEE 99 Rock the Key down in Noonan, Georgia, home of The Walking Dead. We are live as well on the United Public Radio Network on 107.7 FM in New Orleans and over 160 countries around the world. We're live at spacedoutradio.com, Spreaker, KTLK, The Fringe FM, Renegade Talk Radio out of Las Vegas, the High Plains Talk Radio Network, and if you're listening in on Revolution Radio, remember the Double R Machine is a donation station financed by you, the valued listener. Head on over to freedomslips.com and donate today. If you like our theme music, you can thank Mr. Ron Bumblefoot THAL, formerly of Guns N' Roses, currently of Art of Anarchy. Yes, Bumblefoot is the official sound of Spaced Out Radio. If you're on social media, you can follow us on Twitter at Spaced Out Radio. Give our Facebook page a like, Spaced Out Radio Show. On Instagram, you can follow me at Dave Scott, SOR. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, Spaced Out Radio Show. Tune us in on TuneIn. Download our shows from iTunes. We're also on RadioGuide.fm, Player.fm, TalkStream Live, and Stitcher. And our website is SpacedOutRadio.com. And if you head over to Patreon.com for as low as $1 a month, you can become a patron of SOR as well. Now, if you want to take part in this show, because we have a lot of people who do, you got to do me a favor. You got to sign into one of the chat rooms. Click on our website. Go to Listen Live. We're right there. You got Revolution Radio's chat room, Spreaker chat room, the UPRN chat room, or maybe you want to join the Facebook group, the SOR Space Travelers Club. That is free. Or if you're on Twitter, use the hashtag SpacedOutRadio. I will get to your questions and comments in there as well. Now, if you head to our website for just $5 a month, you can become an SOR Space Traveler. And as of right now, you can go to our store, pick up a t-shirt, poster, a sticker, or how about VIP passes to our first annual Spaced Out Radio Caribou Paracon, being held September 29th to October 1st right here in 108 Mile Ranch, British Columbia at the Spruce Hills Spa and Resort. We got a ton of speakers for you, paranormal events galore. It's going to be a great weekend. Come hang out with the weirdos this fall. We also, on our website, have the Encounter Online, our great news section put together by Eric Markham and Everett Themer. You can check out my latest blog there as well. And if you've had an experience you can't explain, do me a favor. Fill out an SOR Sightlines report. At 7:15 on September 12, 1952, 3 little boys witnessed a bright object streak across the sky. The object came to rest on land belonging to a local farmer. Once they saw this, whatever it was, land, the boys went up to one of their mom's houses where they reported seeing a UFO crash land in the hills. The entity was initially reported as being about 10 feet tall, 4 feet wide. It appeared to be some sort of robotic suit or spacecraft rather than an organic being. It had a cowl in the shape of an ace of spades behind a red, round head. Set in the head were 2 eyes, described as portals, glowing green and orange, and the size of $50. The body was a metallic armored structure lined with thick vertical pipes. Discrepancies, though, do exist in the actual color of the armor, some claiming it to be black, while others say it was green. The existence of arms is similar. Most state the monster was armless, while others claim it possessed small toy-like arms. Tonight, Frank Feschino, and we're still waiting on Stanton Friedman to join us, are on Spaced Out Radio to talk about this fascinating case that is 60-plus years later still baffling researchers and skeptics alike. Both Frank and Stanton co-wrote The Braxton County Monster, or what we know as the Flatwoods Monster, which can be found everywhere online. Frank, welcome to Spaced Out Radio. How are you?
Great. Glad to be on board, Dave.
I'm still trying to get a hold of Stanton here. It is just after 1 o'clock in the morning where he lives in Nova Scotia. So if you hear some dial tone ringing, that's just old Davey here trying to get a hold of Mr. Friedman. So, I know we had this lined up. I hope something bad didn't happen. That would kind of suck. There he is. Let's see if we got him this time, shall we? We got one ring. This is where I wish the Count from Sesame Street would come back in. I don't know. We may be doing this without your partner here. We're all waiting, anticipating.
Your call.
No, maybe Stanton didn't set his alarm. What do you think, Frank?
That's probably the case, or he's getting ready to set up for the show.
Well, hopefully he is.
Him.
Well, you know what? He's never. We've had him on before, and I know he's a fan of this show. So we're going to try him again a little bit later. You know, that's something that we will do our best to try and get things going. So we are efforting to get Stanton. Hopefully he will be here. So Frank, thank you so much for joining us. You know, a lot of people look at the history of ufology across North America and the world, saying, how come we don't get the real good sightings like we used to? Whether it's Roswell, Shag Harbor, Flatwoods and Braxton, you know, it always seems to be these great stories from 30, 40, 50 years ago when the media wasn't as immediate, when everything was just, you know, still quite simple in life. What do you think the issue is, as today we don't get the good stories and the goods anymore?
There's still a lot of good stories out there, but I think one of the main reasons, Dave, is that the Air Force isn't haphazardly just shooting at things in the sky trying to knock them out, such as was the case back in the 40s and 50s. There were standing Air Defense Command orders to shoot flying saucers down if you couldn't talk them down. That was in late July of 1952 that was revealed.
So what made you become so intrigued about ufology and this story about the Flatwoods Monster?
I wasn't really intrigued with UFOs until I went up to West Virginia to visit some family members who live in Braxton County, and I just kind of stumbled across this case. Basically, that's what happened, Dave. And I found out that it was pretty common up in Braxton County for the people up in the mountains to see flying saucers. They've been seeing them up there for decades. And this was just kind of like a little sidebar thing. Somebody said, you ever heard about the Flatwoods Monster? And I had no idea what they were talking about. It was a long time ago. The people up there stopped talking about this. They were tired of being ridiculed and being made fun of. And they basically shut down shortly after this happened.
Take us back to what happened back in the day. I mean, was it a farming community? Could you describe what Braxton County was?
Flatwoods is located in Braxton County, and it's the geographical center of West Virginia. Mountainous terrain. What was really cool about this, and we're going to refer to this, Dave, as the master map, which is on my website. Did you get my email with that, Dave?
I sure did, yes.
Okay. Now, we can keep referring back to that. But Flatwoods in 1952, there was 300 people that lived in Flatwoods. Now there's a little bit over 400. But the main thing is how desolate this area was. It was not very accessible. There was no interstate. When this happened, people from all over the world went to Flatwoods, which really is amazing, Dave, because what would take a day or two to get from point A to point B, you could do it in an hour on the interstate. It was all mountains back then. And when I started going and researching up there, my cousin Ed said to me, he said, don't think you're going to take a shortcut through these mountains. And I found out the hard way. I thought I was going to get someplace quicker. I ended up getting lost, and about 3 hours later, finally found my way out of one of the hollers. And that's not a place you want to be, up in the mountains there.
Mm-hmm. I'm looking at the map right now, and what amazes me is this seems like it's very mountainous terrain. It almost reminds me of where I am in British Columbia, where I'm literally surrounded by mountaintops. Is this a correct projection of this area?
Yes. Yes, it is.
Interesting. Very interesting. Now, had this area ever gone through this type of information before with ufology? Were there other sightings before, or did this catch a lot of people in this area off guard back in 1952?
They caught them definitely off guard. What I found out is there have been sightings there over the years, but it was very hush-hush. But this story actually split the town in half. There were two camps, the believers and non-believers. It's a Bible Belt area too, Dave. You know, you don't want to talk too much about flying saucers and aliens. You know, I had a lot of difficulties when I was up there. You know, people showing me their guns, telling me to get off the property. Situations you don't want to really be into if you're not armed. So after all those years, from 1952 until I started in the early 90s, nothing much had changed. Between the early 90s and now, it really has changed as far as restaurants, and there's McDonald's there and Kentucky Fried Chickens, and there's hotels, but it was basically unchanged when I started researching years ago. But what was really awesome about this story is when I started researching it, Dave, what was more interesting was the way that the people would respond to the word Flatwoods Monster or Braxton County Monster. That intrigued me more than the story itself. These people were scared, and they were hiding something at the same time. And that's when I started looking into it a little bit deeper, was just seeing the reactions of the locals. They wanted nothing to do with this story. And when I found out that it was basically a silly Halloween season story when it would be reported on, and by the time I started getting a couple of years into the research, which I had no idea it was going to be going this far, the people were starting to open up a little bit, and the people that were slamming doors in my face were basically inviting me in for breakfast, and then I'd end up having lunch and dinner, and I'd be there for the whole damn day. But the people have to trust you before they talk to you.
Very true indeed. Why do you think that this report of the Flatwoods Monster seems to be so silent compared to other UFO crashes? I'm thinking Kecksburg, I'm thinking Roswell, Shag Harbor up here in Canada, and other events that seem to really take precedence over something like this. Because, let's face it, 5 years between Roswell and Flatwoods isn't that long of a time.
No, and Flatwoods was actually the 10th biggest news story in the world that year. But what happened is intelligence came into the area, and they worked on a covert mission, and they silently just crushed this story and made a joke out of it. And it just goes right along to a series of events of make a joke out of it. Let the people run with the story, and it'll destroy itself. And that's basically what happened, Dave. And then you have the ridiculous drawing that was seen on TV. We can get into that later throughout the course of the story as I'm telling it. But the monster wearing a skirt with arms and claws and all of that stuff, that was a big joke too. That just added to the misinformation of what was going on in Flatwoods.
So you said the government went there and shut everything down. How did they use the disinformation in order to all of a sudden make this town or this story so-called go away?
They worked through the state police, the police departments, and which eventually just worked its way right into the press. Some of the articles would start out serious, then within a few days, the story was running rampant, and one particular article would say, Flatwoods Monster has grown from 17 to 17 feet overnight. The people can't get their story straight. And, that every hillbilly joke in the world was told back then. Mm-hmm. And you just imagine what some of those were like, Dave. Smoking pot. They
absolutely.
Up, the whole ball of wax, and the people just got fed up with it, and they eventually just shut up. It wasn't easy getting into those mountains to talk to these people, believe me. It was tough.
You bring up a very good point, though. I mean, this is in the days where hillbillies literally were still a culture. And, a lot of people thought they were just a bunch of uneducated rednecks, so to speak. And people not to take the type of people not to take anybody seriously. So I can see where back in the day, these were probably people who were made fun of because of their lack of education, because of the way they lived more simply, maybe governing their own type of laws back then. So, it's an easy place to kind of push this story aside when you're dealing with, for relative terms, uneducated people.
The majority of the people lived off of the land up there and had their own animals. There was a little general store in the area, and that was kind of like the meeting and gossip place for the town. But the majority of the people lived off of the land. They grew their own vegetables, they had their own animals. And it's interesting, when I started investigating up there years ago, a couple of the old-timers up there, one in particular called Jack Davis, he was a witness and he saw the craft coming in. And he would do what he could to explain everything to me of what it was like with the culture up there. And it was quite interesting. Some of them were warnings of how to talk with the people. But it wasn't easy at the beginning.
So if we have the simplicity of these people, would they have been the type of people who would have been intimidated by government officials or the military coming in?
Some of them were. One witness I spoke to said that intelligence had come to his house and they didn't tell him. He was just a little kid because the age range of the witnesses of the kids was from like 17 years old, 18 years old, back to about 5 years old. And this one particular witness, who really didn't even want to tell me this story, because he told me that the family was told to be quiet and it would be best for the witness, who was just a kid at the time, and the family and grandparents if he just didn't talk to any more reporters. And this was the case throughout the town. They were basically told to be quiet and it would be in the best interest to keep things low. But the story had shotgunned so fast around the world, and it was just tough to keep it under control. It happened that fast. We didn't get into the beginning of what was going on in 1952, but 1952 had the most reported UFO sightings to Project Blue Book in history. And there was basically stuff going on virtually every day back then, Dave. Every day there was something going on. And there were only a fraction of these incidents and sightings were ever reported, especially up in Flatwoods. They didn't know how to go about contacting, intelligence at Project Blue Book up at Wright Pat. So there was a lot of things going on back then where it could be swayed very easily in one direction or the other. And when I first came into the town and they gave me a hard time, I had to prove myself, and I started pulling some of the classified intelligence documents out of Project Blue Book. What amazed me was back in the early 90s is how many newspaper articles were different around the country and around the world. It's like the old thing where you start a story out and then you tell it, and by the time it gets to the end of the line or in the circle, the last person, how much it changes. That's what happened with Flatwoods. The story was almost unrecognizable. That's why it took even twice as long for me to investigate this case, because it was such a screw-up.
So what makes you think that this story was such a screw-up? What led to that point, Frank?
The actual appearance of the monster and what went down. The monster was thought to have been a 10 to 12 foot tall entity that was wearing a dress that floated and had arms and claws, and it was wearing a hood that looked like from the KKK. It was a pointy hood and like the shape of an ace of spades, and in reality, it wasn't. It was actually a small hover-type craft, and it was approximately close to 12 foot tall, and it had a being in it. And this was some type of a hovercraft that came out of a larger craft that was damaged and had landed up on the Fisher farm in back of the witness's house.
Now, you mentioned this thing, and let's go to the crash site. Let's go back to what I said in the introduction to this show about 3 young lads who saw something strange in the sky. Would you like to break down your information on that?
Actually, it was a whole crew. It was the majority of the town. That story's a well-known one. There were 3 kids. I remember when I first started talking to Kathleen May. Kathleen May was the primary witness involved in this case, and her 2 boys, Eddie and Freddie. What had happened is when I started working with her at the beginning, I was showing her articles, and this is all I knew. This is all I had to go by. And she would just laugh and say, how are you going to have a football game with 3 kids? She's told me that every Friday night at that point during football season, that the kids would go out there and they would play football. And the little kids were involved, you know, from the elementary school, middle school, and high school. It was just like one big giant game. And a couple of the older kids, they would be the quarterback or they would be the coach on the side. So it was one big Friday night event. Here's another thing, too. There was only a couple TVs and a couple radios in all of Braxton County. Now, imagine that, the whole county, let alone just Flatwoods. There was only a couple cars and 1 police car. So you're talking really backwoods area where the kids basically, they just had to come up with their own entertainment for themselves. And this was one of them. They would play baseball and football, and that was the whole point, the beginning, what you had said. It was just a big activity on a Friday night, and the kids all happened to be outside on the playground at the Flatwoods Elementary School, and they saw this big flaming object come over the mountain, and it made a 45-degree angle turn, went back across the street, and landed up in the mountains. It stopped in midair and then dropped, almost what the kids talked about like a door falling down. It settled down. It didn't crash straight in on a flat trajectory like a meteor would, but it settled down into a clearing in the back part of the woods a couple miles away. They saw this thing go down.
So you mentioned a lot of people in the town saw this event happening. You talked to a number of the eyewitnesses. What were they feeling at that time when they saw this, Frank?
Some of the boys thought it was a meteor, the little kids, and the older boys who spotted it knew it was something that wasn't supposed to be there. They thought maybe it was, they had heard of UFOs because it was popular in 52 there, you know, with the amount of sightings. A couple of them thought it was an airplane, but through the aerodynamics of this craft, it would have been tough to make a 45-degree angle turn. And that's what this craft did, and then it stopped in air. They did see flames coming off of it, and it was close enough where they could see the shape of it. It was an oval shape, Dave. It basically looked like a football. It was aerodynamic, basically like a football. And the people that had seen it from a distance at different points of Braxton County thought it was an airplane because they only saw certain, you know, parts of the flight path of the trajectory coming in. But the kids, the younger kids, thought it was a meteor. The older ones, they didn't know. They would look like a UFO, or it was unidentified, not a flying saucer. It was a UFO by its maneuvers. It was close enough to the ground where they got a good look at it. I mean, its height off of the ground. It came in over the mountain from the north, and when it passed over the school ground, it was pretty low.
You know, that would freak a lot of people out, especially during that time. I mean, just coming out of World War II a decade earlier, or less than a decade earlier, and wondering now what is going on. They would have heard War of the Worlds. They would have heard a lot of stories about Roswell and everything. But considering it's a religious-type town, did a lot of people believe that maybe, due to religion, that this was the end of the world?
Not from the people that I talked to, because the whole theory of the meteor was just put to rest very quickly after the kids ran up onto the farm with Mrs. May, and they saw this thing that was called the monster. But when I worked real close with Freddie May, and Freddie May said that some of the kids were shouting it was a meteor. Some were saying it was a flying saucer. You know, you have kids in the range from 5 years old up to 18 years old who don't see a hell of a lot going on up there. I mean, Dave, only 2 cars in the whole county, and you know, one of them was the sheriff's car, and you know, they didn't know what it was. That's why they made their venture to go up to the back and find out what was going on there.
So this object crashes to the ground in West Virginia in the mountains, where there's a lot of redneck and hillbilly people who like to keep to their own. But one thing that I do have to ask, what is it about West Virginia, Ohio, Pennsylvania, that triangle area, that just sees so much weird and strange happen?
I think there's some type of a vortex up there, and that area of Braxton County, because I've seen UFOs up there over the years on several occasions, and it got to the point where it was just, you see them so often it was boring, where some people, you know, wait a lifetime and never see one. There's parts of Braxton County up in Flatwoods and Frametown that seem to be a vortex. Crop circles, they were appearing on my cousin's property in Frametown, which is just right next to Flatwoods. So there's a lot of stuff going on up there. There still is to this day. As far as the Flatwoods case, the Flatwoods case was an isolated incident that just happened on this one particular day, because I was able to retrace and write my book and the story by working in reverse, by pinpointing all the different locations, as you see on that master map there, Dave. And it was just retracing all the steps. I knew every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. The Flatwoods was just the end of it. I worked backwards in time to establish the flight paths and origins and try to figure out what actually happened there. And that was an adventure in itself, which now I'm over 25 years involved in this case, kind of took me over.
I can understand that. I can understand where everything would be very, very strange at that time, especially in that area with Wright Pat and the experiences and sightings that have happened out of there. You know, I mean, Kicksburg, on relative terms of a map, isn't that far away. Mothman in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. We just seem to have a lot of different issues happening in those three states. And I'm wondering, do you think there is, in your opinion, maybe some sort of weird government experimentation that was happening there, or do you think this is all just supernatural?
I think it's all supernatural. It's something to do with the mountains up there. Years ago, I even found out that the Indians wouldn't settle through certain parts of West Virginia because of their folklore would talk about weird things, and they didn't want to settle down throughout parts of the mountains up there. And, you know, it was just, when I started going up there in the early 90s, Dave, I would just kind of like sit back and as observer, and they would have one of the things would be having a big pig roast or a party, and everybody would gather around from the town. And that's when I would start hearing some of the stories, and I just kind of took it with a grain of salt. Yeah, right. And I made a comment once, and some guy got really pissed off at me, and he said, "Hey, boy," he said, "don't you be making fun of us up here in the mountains. Get your ass out up there at midnight to 4 in the morning, then you tell us what you see." Well, I ended up doing that, and guess what? He was right. Scared the hell out of me the first couple times I seen him up there, because I had no idea of what was going on in that area. And as the more I started looking into it, I started finding out there was other cases that had occurred there over the years. Some of them were quite big, and some of them were kept small. And the people don't talk about it much. The word doesn't get out of the mountains. The people still don't want to be laughed and ridiculed at. But after being persistent and working with so many people, and I showed them that I could prove this Flatwoods case happened with my research, because I was the first person to go through the government documents, the Blue Book documents. And that was a pain in the neck too, Dave, because the ink was faded on a lot of the documents when they were photographed to go into archive on microfilm. And I had to spend years just re-inking and going over the documents to make them legible and enlarging them, and, you know, using modern technology to try and understand what was going on in the text, the body of the text of these reports. And that was about 5 or 6 years just to do that. And then I had to decipher them and put them all together. I combined them with newspaper articles, with eyewitness accounts, and the more information I got, I would bring it up into the mountains, and I would start showing it to the people, and they would open up to me. And they had no idea that this case behind the scenes was this involved, and I didn't either. I had no idea whatsoever until I started getting further into it, and then I started connecting all the dots together, and here we are over 25 years later. And I'm still finding information out from people contacting me around the world through the internet. And shows like this, Dave, people will hear something. It's happened quite a few times, and then they'll contact me on my website. Sometimes I'll hook up and do an interview, and I'll post it on the website, or I'll just hold it and wait for it to come out at another point in a movie or something.
So when you look at the situation that happened, the government comes in, it really stirs up everybody. Did they go silent up until you started poking around because they just didn't want the attention and they thought it was bad for their community?
That's exactly right, Dave. That's what happened. They were just tired of being made fun of. They heard all the jokes, they heard all the ridicule, And like I said earlier, it was a silly season story, a Halloween story. That's the only time you would hear about it. And the people and the press would just ad-lib and make up more crap just, to juice the story up. And it became unrecognizable. The only research I had back when I started was just by going to different libraries and looking this up. Unsolved Mysteries in the Reader's Digest hardcover book. That was a big one. The little Frank Edwards books, the paperback books, the books that came out in the late 50s and early 60s. There was a drove of them up through 66 with the UFO flap of 66 and into the 70s, all those little Dell books. And that's where I was getting my information. And when I lined all of these books up, every story was different. So the best way to get to the bottom of it is go to the primary source, and that's what I attempted at the beginning to do. And in the long run, I ended up working with several of the witnesses. And the more you showed them and the more you proved, the more they opened up and the more they talked to you.
Well, one of the things that I find interesting is the fact that they were able to keep people out of there. Whether it was the threat of violence, whether it was just being non-committal on the subject, whatever the topic may be. But were there people in that area yearning to know what it was, or were they just all too scared to even pursue it ever further because of what the government did?
Some of the witnesses that I worked with, and one in particular, was just scared by the government because he was told behind closed doors, this would be best for you not to talk about this. Mrs. May and a couple of the other witnesses, they were just being interviewed by everybody. I don't think all the armed forces combined could have stopped that. It hit so quick. Ailey Stewart, who was the co-owner of the Braxton County Democrat, is the one that was the first Johnny on the spot up there that night after the incident happened. And he's the one that broke the story to the Charleston Gazette. And then it hit United Press International, and it was all over the place. What you add into the equation, the Flatwoods Story occurred, the incident happened about 8 o'clock on September 12th, 1952, 8 p.m. And the story didn't break in the papers till Sunday, but there were articles all over the United States and up and down the eastern seaboard into the mid-Atlantic area about flaming objects seen Friday night. And by the time the Flatwoods Story came out, they were starting to put two and two together. Did it ride UFO? Did it ride the flaming meteor? So many reported. There was thousands of reports of UFOs seen up and down the eastern seaboard, and they were actually seen over 10 different states. Nobody just put it together what happened until I started and used this master map. I just started out with a West Virginia map, and you end up seeing that thing's the size of a wall, Dave, that map there. And it's just piecing everything together and piecing it together. And I would start going back and forth more often to West Virginia and staying up there for longer periods of time, interviewing the people. And I would lay all the documents out as I started figuring out what was contained in them. And I started traveling more throughout the country, getting articles about these things that were seen, meteors, damaged planes the night before, UFOs, flying saucers. There was thousands of sightings up and down the eastern seaboard, and this is when I had to start grabbing the bull by the horns and piecing out and figure what happened that night and what went down. And that's when I discovered Flatwoods was the end of the story.
So when you started piecing this puzzle together, and I want to get into what people saw in the next hour, but when you started piecing this puzzle together, Frank, and you started adding all the pieces together where now you're building a story, which is what happens when you're writing a book. How amazed were you that all the pieces that you learned started coming together so effortlessly?
I couldn't believe that this had been missed. Not just the Flatwoods Story, because the Flatwoods Story got picked up on. Like I said, it was shotgun around the world within a couple days, and then Mrs. May went on the We the People program. But what amazed me, put the monster aside, is just all the sightings. You know, there was 21 hours of sustained UFO sightings up and down the eastern seaboard that nobody ever put two and two together. Then the government wrote it off as a single meteor. And it's like, what? 23 hours of sightings. And the hub of them happened between 7 and about 7:30 to 7:40 that night, shortly before the Flatwoods Monster crashed in West Virginia. There was tons of sighting. They were flying over Washington, D.C. at treetop level. The Flatwoods ship was one of them. It was flying at certain points along its flight path trajectory. This thing came over the eastern seaboard, damaged and on fire, and it flew over Washington, D.C. at treetop level. And then there were other craft that were in that area, were actually following it and opening up a corridor, and this thing flew 200 miles west inland, flew over Virginia, flew into West Virginia, and it was actually following the beacons. So many of the other UFOs that night, they were following the beacons of the airports, and they were following rivers. They were following roads not to hit the mountainous terrain. So this was not a meteor by any of the stretch of the imagination, which in the book I devote about a whole chapter to blowing that theory out of the water. It was the Flatwoods Monster incident. When I finally put everything together, it was a damaged craft that was shot down by the Air Force, and there was a subsequent search and rescue mission to go in and extract the craft and or the being that or beings that were inside of it, and it failed miserably.
So what kind of UFOs were people seeing around that area?
There were UFOs seen that night, Dave. I actually interviewed some of them. There were crafts that looked like gigantic fuselage of a plane, some, with no wings, these giant craft. There were flying saucers seen over Flatwoods. There were round objects. There were oval objects. And that's what was confusing to the reporters. And some of the early researchers, they couldn't figure out, well, if the Flatwoods Monster craft came in and that was described as being oval, why was there one that was shaped like a jet with no wings? And why was there one that was round seen over there and over here? They didn't realize that people were all describing their the incidents correctly. There was just so many different UFOs came in, and what they were doing is they were looking for the damaged craft that went down. It was planned to have been set on that hilltop, because that hilltop, or it's mountaintop, but it was a flat area where it came in and it was level and it was a cleared area, a perfect spot for it to touch down and land. And that's what it did. It came in and it went over the school playground after it made a 45-degree angle turn, and then it settled and it landed in that field. And what was interesting is when this thing was seen in the air, it had flames shooting off of it. And there was even a part of the treetop line near the school that was burned. That's how low flying it was. It was struggling to stay airborne. And actually, the former mayor of Flatwoods actually saw this thing come in that night, and up at her house, she told me and pointed to the line of trees where it actually scorched it and burned it. But what's interesting is once it touched down, there were no burn marks on the ground. And when I spoke to Colonel Levitt, who was the head of the West Virginia National Guard, that's what he was very adamant about telling me, that when he went up there that night with troops and searched. But we'll get into that later. But anyways, no burnt marks on the ground, which is unbelievable. But seconds before, it was seen in the air on fire and pieces falling off of it.
You mentioned there was other UFO sightings, and were they seeing triangles? Were they seeing flying saucers? Were they seeing orbs? Were they seeing these cigar-shaped ones? Were people able to describe the craft that they were seeing?
Yes, and at low level, because when these UFOs were coming in, they had to fly down pretty low to get in between that mountainous terrain. And the people were seeing these. I interviewed one fella, and he saw a cigar-shaped object. And he described it. It wasn't the size of a jumbo jet, but it was more on the size of a large Learjet. And this thing came in, and he told me he was a kid. He was about 12 years old, and he was up in the farm with his dad and the kids, and they were cutting and chopping wood. And, you start early for the winter up there, and they were working, chopping the wood, and this thing came over, and it was making slow maneuvers, cutting back and forth and cutting back and forth, and then it would drop into the valley, and he told me, he says it looked like it was looking for something. You could tell it was looking for something. It wasn't flying in 100 miles an hour. It was basically floating. It made no noise. It was making methodical turns, spinning around, dropping, lifting up, and flying through the mountains. And when I asked him what direction it came from, he said it came from the east heading west, and it headed into the direction of Flatwoods. From where he was, the spot was just north, and I was actually at the area. I went to all locations where all the sightings were made.
So how big is that area? How big is Braxton County?
Braxton County is a gigantic area, mostly mountains, and with some small communities. Flatwoods is the geographical center of Flatwoods. And what's interesting is if you trace back on a map, it's directly across from Washington, D.C., and that was a big point, Dave, in figuring out what happened. Because I knew this thing touched down in Flatwoods. Actually, it flew a little north of Flatwoods to the northern part of Braxton County over Burnsville, made a 45-degree angle turn, and came down across the main cut-through State Route 4, and it followed the road. But it went and was sighted, and I was able to plot its different flight path points throughout its trajectory through Project Blue Book and newspaper accounts. There was tons of newspaper accounts in Washington. Dave, it was unbelievable how well this thing was documented and just stuck away and buried. The one thing you have to remember is a lot of people didn't report this, and the people that didn't know what was going on. Some people came out later on after the initial shock, and they would, give their point of view of what was seen. But in the end of it, it was just a big cluster screw-up that didn't make sense, because all the people thought there was one Flatwoods Monster craft, and why were there so many other ones? And when I was able to establish there were 25 of them that night, Dave, including the Flatwoods, and most of them all had different descriptions. It's like I remember talking with Stanton years ago. It's like different models of cars. we have different models of cars, and maybe some of these craft had different missions, or, you know, they would have, you know, set up for to do something in particular. One may have been a fighter, one may have been a reconnaissance jet, per se, but in the long run, that's all. There was 25 different UFOs, including a mother craft that was seen over the area of Delaware that was the size of Dirigible or the Hindenburg. And that was seen hovering just about the coast. Then you have the craft like the Flatwoods craft, the smaller ones.
I know this question is completely hypothetical, but we got about 45 seconds before we got to go to break. Do you think with that many craft seen in the sky the night the Flatwoods crash happened, that maybe they were all some sort of squadron of UFOs flying over and this one just happened to have trouble? Or do you think maybe, you know, it was tailing things, or just, you know, I realize it's a dumb question. I do. But I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
There was actually several different UFOs that were damaged that night. There was 3 that came in over the eastern seaboard and split and went into a fan pattern, and they went throughout the mid-Atlantic part of the United States, and there was a 4th craft that came in from the direction of Florida. So we have actually 4 total damaged craft.
All right, my friend, we're going to hop out for our first break of the night. Frank Feschino is our guest. We are still efforting to get Stanton Friedman on the air with us, but it is 2 a.m. where Stanton is. Maybe the old sleepy eyes got to him a little too hard, but we're going to keep on trying. More Flatwoods Monster coming up on Spaced Out Radio right after this. Coming September 29th to October 1st, the first annual Spaced Out Radio Caribou Paracon. Hi, this is Dave Scott. The event will be held at the Spruce Hills Spa and Resort in 108 Mile Ranch, British Columbia. Come join us for an amazing weekend of speakers talking all things paranormal, UFOs, ghosts, aliens, Sasquatch, intuitiveness. Listen to great speakers like Miriam Delicato, Samantha Mowat, and the crypto guru Ronald Murphy. Get your VIP passes by going to spacedoutradio.com and clicking on the Paracon banner. Come to BC, where the paranormal is waiting for you.
From coast to coast to coast, Blacklight Uncharted is taking on the paranormal across Canada. From ghostly hauntings to the UFOs flying above in conjunction with MUFON Canada, we're closely investigating what's going on in the northern skies and checking out the apparitions that walk among us. Check out our videos right here at spacedoutradio.com. We want to know your thoughts, we want to hear your experiences, and we want you to share your stories. The answers are out there, and we intend to find them.
Would you like to become one of our space travelers? All you have to do is click on the Space Travelers icon at spacedoutradio.com. For only $5 a month, you can get access to some great prizes, as well as private monthly shows, newsletters, and a members-only section on our website. Become a space traveler today.
It's paranormal news at its finest. Welcome to The Encounter. At spacedoutradio.com, The Encounter online is SOR's trusted news source for everything weird and strange going on around the world. This is news editor Eric Markham. Our team of journalists are scouring the planet for those strange stories that rarely make the mainstream. No fear-mongering or fake news here. Head over to spacedoutradio.com and encounter The Encounter.
Hey, this is Canadian Paranormal Investigator Mike Moore. The third Wednesday of every month, I'll be teaming up with Dave Scott to bring you Ghosts of the Great White North. Each month, we will bring on guests from across Canada to discuss their ghostly encounters. Canada is a paranormal hotbed with stories you've never heard, so we're going to bring them to you. So get comfy on your Chesterfield, grab a donut, and join us, eh?
Have you had an experience you can't explain? Had a run-in with ghosts, maybe Bigfoot, or seen lights in the sky? Hi, I'm Mike Schmidt from the SOR Sightlines. I'm here to investigate your sighting. Head to spacedoutradio.com and fill out a report on the Sightlines. All your information is 100% confidential, and I will help you figure out what you've been seeing. File your report, and let's find out the answers together.
Visit purpleplates.com today. For over 40 years, the Purple Energy Plates have been delivering amazing results for their many customers. Inspired by the great genius Nikola Tesla, the harmony, healing, and energetic effects of the plates have proven over and over to be beneficial and often miraculous to thousands of customers. With their money-back guarantee and the many benefits, how can you afford not to get one? Check their site for daily specials and choose from their many energy products. You won't be sorry. Visit them today at purpleplates.com for mind, body, and spirit, and expect a miracle.
Are you interested in advertising on Spaced Out Radio? Head to our website at spacedoutradio.com and click on our advertising tab. There, you will find an assortment of ways you can get your product out there with us, from radio commercials to banners and social media. Have a product you like our hosts to endorse? We can do that too. Visit spacedoutradio.com for more details.
Have you got your Cosmic Passport? If you need one, tune in to Cosmic Passport on Spaced Out Weekend. This is Elizabeth Anglin, ET experiencer, spirit medium, and host of Cosmic Passport. Each weekend I'll be bringing you interviews and support from other paranormal experiencers, and the best in intuitive spiritual guidance from across the globe. It's all happening starting at 9 p.m. Pacific Time, midnight Eastern, on spacedoutradio.com.
From British Columbia to Northern California, Pacific North Weird has Cascadia covered. Check out our feature videos at spacedoutradio.com, where I, Vincent Zunza, and my super sleuth partner Alexandra Sullivan track down the weird and strange stories from around the Pacific Northwest. From Bigfoot to Mel's Hole and everything in between. This is what makes life exciting. So why report the normal when we can report the Pacific North Weird right here at spacedoutradio.com.
Oh, there's only one way to rock. Loud and proud. In high definition. Radio 702 rocks. Las Vegas.
Every Saturday and Sunday night, as Dave Scott wanders aimlessly in the wilderness, you can come hang out with me, James Tyson, in Spaced Out Weekend. Starting at 9 p.m. Pacific, midnight Eastern, I'll take you along as we talk with some of the best experts in their fields. SpacedOutRadio.com is the place to find us. So sit down, relax, put your feet up, enjoy the topics like the paranormal, supernatural, intuitiveness, and so much more. Hope to see you there.
Don't have time to listen to Spaced Out Radio Live? Wherever you are, the car, the office, the shower, or even if you're traveling, we're right here for you. Each Spaced Out Radio show can be found on iTunes, TuneIn, and on our YouTube channel, Spaced Out Radio Show. It's the perfect way for you to catch up on our shows. For more information, just head over to our website, spacedoutradio.com, and tune in to us today.
The views and opinions expressed by tonight's guest and topic of discussion do not necessarily represent the official policy or position of Spaced Out Radio, Spaced Out Weekend, Spaced Out Radio Limited, its hosts, syndicated carriers, or anyone associated with this broadcast. Would you like to connect with us? Head to spacedoutradio.com for all your latest show info. And hit us up on Twitter using the hashtag Spaced Out Radio. Now, back to Dave Scott and SOR.
Welcome back to Spaced Out Radio tonight. I am your host, Dave Scott. Good to have you with us. Tomorrow night, I may be here, or it may be Eric Markham hosting. One of the two. Because I am going down to the coastline from where I live on the mountains. My beautiful daughter is going to be going to her high school prom tomorrow night for graduation, and I'm going for a wonderful picture of my daughter in the beautiful dress. So I may be back, I may not. If not, Eric Markham will be hosting for me. Tomorrow night will be David Adair as our guest on Spaced Out Radio, 9 p.m. Pacific, midnight Eastern time. The show is always live at spacedoutradio.com. We got you covered here. So once again, if I'm not here, Eric Markham will be here. David Adair is our guest, but I'm going to play Dad tomorrow, and I hope you don't mind. I want that picture with my daughter, because she only graduates high school once, and I know all of you will understand. Hey, if you want to follow us on social media, you can do so on Twitter at Spaced Out Radio. Use the hashtag Spaced Out Radio. If you want to connect with us live during the show as well, you can give our Facebook page a like, Spaced Out Radio Show. Tune us in on TuneIn. Download this show and others on iTunes. Our website is spacedoutradio.com, where we have a plethora of features for you, including joining the SOR Space Travelers Club for $5 a month, reading up on the encounter online, our news section. Go to the Spaced Out Radio store, pick up a t-shirt, poster, even some stickers, and you can pick up VIP passes. They are 10% off until July 31st for the first annual Caribou Paracon, put on by Spaced Out Radio right here in 108 Mile Ranch, British Columbia, September 29th to October 1st. We'd love to see you with us. Come hang out with the weirdos. We got a great weekend planned. You will have a lot of fun, I can guarantee it. We welcome in everyone listening in on WQEE 99 Rock the Key down in Noonan, Georgia, home of The Walking Dead. We are also live on KTLK, The Fringe FM, United Public Radio Network on 107.7 FM in New Orleans and over 160 countries around the world, Renegade Talk Radio, and if you're listening in on Revolution Radio, remember the Double R Machine is a donation station financed by you, the valued listener. Head on over to freedomslips.com and donate today. Bill Cardwell has set the password for tonight in the Spaced Out Radio SOR Space Travelers Club. Banjulele. Banjulele is your password for tonight. Use it wisely, Space Travelers, as Bill sets a password each and every night right here on the mighty SOR. I think we're going to be without Stanton Friedman tonight, and Stanton never cancels on an interview. Okay, he loves talking about these subjects, especially the Flatwood Monster. Okay, but Stanton, according to Frank, was coming back from Italy. Maybe he got screwed up on his flights or something, but you know Stanton better than I do, Frank, writing a book with him. You know when he makes a commitment, he's usually there.
Yeah, we've been doing this for a lot of years. I know he was in Italy and in Europe, and he was coming back and getting ready to go out to Roswell, so there was a snag someplace.
That's okay. That's okay. We know...
We're going to go here because we got a lot to talk about, Dave.
Absolutely we do. Absolutely, and this is where it's going to get a lot of fun. Now, in 1952, there were a plethora of UFO sightings, not only around the area of West Virginia where the Flatwood Monster incident happened, but around the United States. It seems like ufology had taken over everywhere. Eisenhower was president, I believe, at the time, and there's still word and rumor and conspiracy whether or not he signed a treaty, technology for humans and animals. You know, I mean, that might be putting our tinfoil hats on a little too tightly, but the fact is, at that time, people were UFO crazy, and they were staring up at the skies all the time, seeing what they could see. Take us back to 1952, Frank.
Well, 52 was a record year for reports that were sent to Project Blue Book. And Project Blue Book was at White Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, and the guys up there were in charge of investigation and evaluation of reports from 51 until 69. Well, what we have in the summer of 52, there was 111 unknowns out of 1,134 reports. And the Summer of the Saucers is what the catchphrase is called it. There were sightings in June, July, August, and September, and that was the pinnacle. The Flatwoods fell right into the end of the flap of 1952 this summer. And during the course of that time, we had the July 19th and 20th and the 26th and 27th weekends where the UFOs flew over Washington and Virginia. There were jets scrambled out. Then August 5th, there was actually a third consecutive weekend where jets were in the air also over the Washington area. Then we have on July 28th, shoot them down orders that were revealed by the United States Air Force. Monsell Mons, he was the information officer for the Air Force, and he gave this public address. It ended up going through the INS, International News Service, and it appeared in a minimal amount of newspapers. And the same day that appeared in the newspapers, the shoot 'em down stories, later in the day, that's where the press conference was held in Pentagon, the famous Pentagon press conference. That's when they dropped the curtain down in front of the public, and that's when they wrote off stuff, the temperature inversions and whatnot. That's a whole story in itself. But anyways, you fast forward 6 weeks later, after these shoot-down orders, that's when all of this happened in Flatwoods, and we had 21 hours of sustained UFO sightings. And I was able to establish 116 documented locations over 10 east states where these craft were seen. And multiple craft were making repeated landings. Parts were falling off of them, pieces. The things were blowing up along their flight paths, and I had to put some type of a cohesive order to all of this and try and figure this out. And I work with retired military personnel, police officers, state troopers, air traffic controllers. I didn't do this on myself, Dave. I had a lot of help from other people to put this together. And it was tough at the beginning to get people to work on this with me. But once I started pulling all of my information together and laying it out, let me give you an example. All the different UFO sightings that were seen throughout the United States, just because there was 1,000 sightings, Dave, over 10 states, didn't mean that there was 1,000 UFOs. I had to be able to distinguish flight path characteristics, appearances of what they look like, the color, size, shapes, what directions they were flying. And once I was able to do that, I would figure out it was one particular craft seen at 12 or 15 different points. And being an illustrator and trained in oil painting and acrylic, I was able to do sketches, comprehensive sketches of these different crafts and what they look like, and then I would label them, and then I would make a corresponding star or mark on my master map, and I knew that was one particular craft. Then I would do paintings of them. And my house looked like a UFO museum for years. And every time I would get another piece of information, I would fill it into the flight path trajectory. Okay, this sighting was seen here. Found another newspaper article. I found another piece in Project Blue Book. A witness told me something. So what it was is basically just putting this breadcrumb trail together. And once I got all the pieces into place, I was able to differentiate each one of the crafts that was seen. If it was a saucer shaped, if it looked like a dirigible, if it was round. There was a couple different sightings where there was a round craft and it had a flat top on it. Then you have the mothership in the Delaware area where it was the size of the Hindenburg. And I did illustrations of all of these, and I would set them up on the walls and around the floor and on the furniture all over the house and stand there and look at this master map and try to figure out what happened. And I eventually got a couple people together, and one guy in particular helped me lay this whole thing out. You have to be military-minded to understand what happened that night in Flatwoods, and I got a military person to help me out and laid it out in front of me, and then I ran from it from there. Once I got it into my head what was going on, it was a lot easier, but I had no idea of what was going on, and most people didn't either. If you look back in a lot of the history books, there's nothing about this Flatwoods. There's, a few sightings, but nothing to this magnitude, and I can't believe that this was, as far as I know, the biggest single day event UFO flap in American history, and it went right over everybody's head and everybody missed it. There was a lot of action going on, a lot of stuff going on. The people didn't pick up on it back then because it happened over such a wide area, Dave. They didn't piece it together. And then the headlines started coming out saying they were meteors. It was meteor showers seen over one particular area. Up in the area of Pittsburgh, there was another craft that went down in the Wheeling area, and there was an isolated, what was said, a meteor shower over the Pittsburgh area, in the Wheeling area in Ohio. There were search craft that were coming down and descending out of the sky, going into certain pinpointed areas looking for downed craft. That's what they were doing. It wasn't a meteor shower. That would have been the most isolated meteor shower on Earth. Some of them, what were said to be crashing airplanes, they were landing between the towers and beacons on mountaintops and then taken back off again and circling over the areas. Meteors don't do this. It was absolutely ridiculous, but nobody went any further because the government and the different personnel from the airports reported it as they were meteors, so everybody took it at their word. But it was the furthest thing from a meteor. It would have been mass hysteria that night if the public really knew what was going on, that we were actually invaded and we had damaged craft down that were taken down by the Air Force. And the proof of it is right in the map. And the cool thing about this is, Dave, about 80% of the information that I used, I got right in the Project Blue Book documents. Nobody ever took time to go through them. What happened is that when the original, what are called the tentative observers questionnaires and reports from the public were sent to the Air Force, they sat around for years and they were eventually photographed, okay? But what happened is they were copied first. The masters were put away, and the copies on the old Xerox machines back then, the ink faded on them while they sat there waiting for millions of documents to get photographed to be put on microfilm. So what happened is, by the time they got around to the Flatwoods case, the ink was dissipating off of the copies. Do you understand what I mean? So you can only see a partial document. So I had to go in there and enlarge stuff, and some documents I had to re-ink over again. I got handwriting analysis books because a lot of these questionnaires, they were handwritten by the witnesses. They would just follow a pattern and, you know, what direction was it flying? What did it look like? What color was it? What shape was it? And then some of the people actually were drawing little pictures and descriptions of the different crafts that they seen. So I had to go in and re-ink, and that took between 5 and 6 years just to do all of those pages. Then once I got everything together, I had to figure out what the hell was going on, and that took several more years. And it was a good team effort. I had a lot of people helping me. As far as the documents, I would Xerox some of the 8 by 10 pages up to 3 by 4 feet. And I would give them to friends and family members and people that were helping me with the project, and they would just hang them on their refrigerator or hang them up in their house, and they would look at it and go, oh, shoot, there's a word, and they would contact me, we would re-ink it in. So this went on for years to find out what happened that night, Dave. And finally, when I started working with more people, that's when this whole thing started pulling together. I started getting a pair of fresh eyes, trained military people, police, and it turned into a fun project.
I have evidence from Project Blue Book in my studio here that I got sent to by a gentleman, a ufologist out of Miami, Ohio, named Rob Mercer, who coincidentally went to a garage sale that he saw on Craigslist, of all things, bought a box of junk, and there happened to be a bunch of pictures and documents from Project Blue Book that were unclassified in here. a stash that not many people have seen before. This Project Blue Book went a lot deeper than what most of us really figured, didn't it?
It sure did. Mrs. May, the primary witness to the Flatwoods Monster, and some of the other young kids that I worked with as adults had no idea. They didn't even know what Project Blue Book was. But they had no idea of how much this was followed up on. It was a very dead serious case. And once you see what this Flatwoods Monster actually was, I could understand why it was covered up. And I've had this discussion with Stanton a million times. And he would say to me, Frank, they had to cover it up. You're coming a few years post-World War II, and, you know, the world is still panicky. And then you have UFOs seen all over the eastern seaboard, and things crashing out of the sky that were shot down, trigger-happy pilots. And here you have these 10 to 12-foot tall aliens and spacesuits coming out. And one of them was the Flatwoods Monster was actually seen the following night in Frametown, and it was described as a reptilian, a thing that looked like a snake was actually inside of this thing, Dave. That's why it was covered up. This is why the whole thing was covered up, because the Air Force knew what was going on, and that's why they responded to a phone call. They knew they shot this thing down, and they knew they actually shot 3 of them down. And the first immediate contact where troops were sent in was Colonel Levitt, Ground Forces. He was the head of the National Guard, the West Virginia National Guard in 1952, and he had to gather up approximately 180 troops. And they went to 2 designated areas. One was down the road a few miles in the area of Sugar Creek, where another UFO had went down. Then he went up to the area of Flatwoods, and he went on to the farm on a covert mission, came in through the logging road on the backside of the road not to disturb the town, because they didn't want anybody to know that the troops were up there. I knew the troops were up there, and it was general knowledge that the troops were up there the following day and subsequent weeks for crowd control, because the story went so haywire, Dave. They estimate in the first 4 to 6 weeks after the Flatwoods Monster incident hit the press, there was 10,000 people in this little town of 300. That's a lot of people. There hadn't been 10,000 people in Flatwood since it was incorporated back at the turn of the century. And then you have all these people coming into this little Bible Belt community, asking a lot of questions, cracking jokes, you know, tearing up, you know, the property, that whole area. It wasn't good for the area. It wasn't good by any stretch of the imagination. And then the further the story got, the more jokes that came out of it. So the primary witnesses just shut up. They were tired of the ridicule. Even generations of kids after all those years were even ridiculed. Oh, your parents and grandparents and blah, 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 you know, and they would start making fun of the kids. So there was a lot of repercussions down the line. But still, in the background, in the minds of a lot of people, they knew something happened up there. And the way I look at it is the West Virginia National Guard was called up there that night. Nobody had known that Colonel Levitt was up on that hill with approximately 50 troops, because they were told to be quiet about it. And when I eventually interviewed Colonel Levitt, he got a call early morning, a.m. He was up there with all the troops. It took a while for him to gather, but it was pretty serious because he got a call from the Air Force. He got a call from Washington and was told to go up there. And when he went up with his troops, I spoke and interviewed him in the early 90s with a video camera. And he told me how Washington called them. They wanted to know what it was. That was his quote. The Air Force wanted to know what it was. And when I asked him how long he stayed up on that spot of the crash site, he stayed up there for a little while, approximately about 45 minutes to an hour. He took some samples from the area, some of the debris, some of the oil that was strewn throughout the field and up at the tree where the sighting occurred. And then he went to the other crash site, and they were told it was an airplane that had went down. And some of the locals over at the Sugar Creek area down the Elk River had described this thing that hit into a mountainside. But when Levitt told me they went across the river with boats that the Guard had, there was never any survivors. There was never any craft found. There was nothing. What they were actually looking at was another damaged craft that was puddle jumping throughout the United States that came in from the southern portion of the country. And they were trying to put these two crafts together in the same area, and it was an abortion. And everybody left the area. The Flatwoods Monster ship landed in Frametown, and that's where this 9 to 10 foot tall reptilian was seen the next night by a couple motorists whose car had broken down in the area. So a lot of stuff was going on, but one of the key things when I was speaking with Levitt up on the spot, Colonel Levitt told me that his troops stayed the night. And I got confused for a second, and I said, what? And he said he was up there for 45 minutes to an hour. He left, went down and set up approximately 100 plus more troops looking for what was said to have been a crashed airplane. And then he added, but his men stayed on Flatwoods overnight in case something else happened. And that's a key point in his interview, in case something else happened. In other words, the Air Force didn't know what happened. They knew they shot something down, and something was lurking around up in those mountains, and they didn't know where the hell it was. That's why they called ground forces to go in there. The Air Force couldn't do anything from the air. What are they going to do, start strafing and shooting at UFOs on the ground with civilians? No. At that point, the Air Force was useless. They needed ground support. They needed men to go in there on foot to search the area, and Levitt told me the Air Force wanted to know what it was. And that's what they were up there looking for. He was told to take the different pieces of the debris that was found, the shrapnel, the oil, where the monster was seen at the tree. He told me he had to take portions of the leaves off and the bark and the soil. They wanted everything, and he shifted it off up to Washington.
That is interesting, man. That is interesting on all of that. Because when you get down to it, it really is amazing how in-depth everything goes with government connection, even though you really wouldn't believe that it is tied that deep. You know, but, I mean, we don't know half the secrets that the government is holding back from us. I have a couple of questions from my audience members here, if you don't mind, Frank, because we always like to get their questions in on the show. And this one comes from Joe, and I think it's a fantastic question. Is it true that more U.S. fighter craft were lost over the continental U.S. in 1952 than in the same period during the Korean War? If so, do you believe it was because they were trying to shoot down UFOs?
Absolutely. That was the main part of my book called Shoot Them Down, The Flying Saucer Air Wars in 1952. And there was a chapter that I compiled and put together called The 6 Deadly Years. and it was throughout the early 1950s, and I compiled data. I used the New York Times as my database, and between 1951 and 1956, there were 205 fighter aircraft accident incidents where aircraft were destroyed, Dave. And I just have the facts and figures here. It's probably easier to read the book. I do actually.
That's a shameless plug. That's a shameless plug. That's okay, though. You're allowed.
But we could do a 3-hour show just on that, just on the shoot 'em down stuff. I do have a lot of statistics on my website, but if you want, I could throw a couple statistics by you right now.
Yeah, please do. Please do. Fire away, man. Fire away. My audience would love to hear it.
The New York Times, between 51 and 56, what I did, Dave, is I went to a local university here, and I pulled out the microfilm and sat there for over a year, 4 or 5 days a week, and I went through all the different pages of the New York Times, okay, looking for fighter accidents. Then I used the index, and I went back and forth, and I just compiled all of these accidents, which didn't make sense, where like 3, 4, 5 jets would crash at the same time. You would have a couple jets that flew into a cloud on a scramble, and the pilots were in communication with each other. One goes into a cloud and is never seen again. Planes falling out of the sky but never touch the ground. I mean, Dave, it's endless and endless. But this is what I found out, and this is in the United States and throughout the world. During that time, I have 231 fighter aircraft were destroyed. 188 were over the United States and 43 around the world. This includes 188. Now there were 205 incidents, okay, where 200 fighter pilots and radar operators, which were like the co-pilots who would sit in back of the Starfires, were killed. And these deaths do not include the mid-air collisions between fighters and non-fighter aircraft. I found and looked into the backgrounds of all of these destroyed aircraft. There were 20 fighter combat veterans who died all over the United States. Now, these were vets during the Korean War and World War II, and several of them were aces. And this is over the United States. We have 19 fighter jets that vanished over the United States, just into thin air. This were never seen again. 16 were jets and 3 were trainers. And the other 7 remaining jets of that 19 had vanished over other countries. And an interesting thing that I came across, and I started talking with a pilot about this, and he just kind of looked at me like I was crazy when I gave him this next statistic. There were 67 pilots that did not bail out and decided to go into the ground or the sea, going down damaged aircraft. 67 did not bail, Dave.
Oh, that's a lot of pilots, and that's a lot of money invested.
But I am going to say that what I found out, of the 67 that did not bail, 3 were said to have ridden it out to avoid cities from a disaster of landing in a city, which now brings that down to 64. So we have 64 airmen over the United States that didn't bail out. And the point has been brought up to me by several other researchers, and Stanton Friedman included, how it may have been counted that the pilots weren't even conscious. They may have been knocked out. Their electrical portions of their jet could have been damaged from a UFO. They could have been jammed, and that would give one reason why these guys wouldn't bail out. That's a lot of guys, 64.
Mm-hmm.
Just right into the ground or rode it into the water, which is kind of scary. We could jump into the multiple jet accidents. There was 13 different cases and incidents, Dave, where between 2 and 4 jets went down at the same time. And the lame excuse used in the majority of those cases, oh, they all ran out of gas. That's why they all went down.
That almost sounds like the Bermuda Triangle and what was happening there.
Right, but this is all over the United States during the shoot-down era, when the Air Defense Command had given orders. Well, the Navy was involved, the Air Force, Marines. If you can't talk them down, shoot them down. And then I started making connections where there were massive UFO sightings that had occurred in the same area where these jets went down. But it's linking them together. And then I started making a map with this, and before you know it, it's like, wow, where these 4 jets went down, there was just a UFO sighting a couple miles away. We have, let me see, let me jump to another statistic here. The 35 men, we could wrap it up with this, okay? 35 men vanished over the United States during this time in their fighter aircraft, 7 over foreign countries. So we have 42 men worldwide who vanished in American aircraft, never to be seen again, during this era of the shoot-down orders. It's a lot of guys, Dave. With all of these different jets, I had one guy at one of my book signings when I gave a PowerPoint presentation, and it was talking about 231 fighter aircraft were destroyed. And he said, you line that many jets up from tail to nose, that's a lot of jets. And the amount of men that were lost inside of them, that's a lot of guys. And I researched some of these particular cases, and they were just like, they look like the Three Stooges wrote them, Dave. And one of them actually occurred on the night of the Flatwoods case, where jet vanished into thin air. And I worked on that case for over a decade. And the men were never born. They never died. The Air Force had no records of these men whatsoever. And when my first book came out, miraculously shortly thereafter, my 2 pilots I was researching, they showed up in documents. I mean, there was no Social Security death index. These guys, there was no record of them even being in the Air Force. And after the book, then the documents came out for that crash. It was just hell trying to find out and working with the Air Force to find out what happened to these guys. I actually, at that point in about 2004 to 2005, there were no records. I actually contacted the brothers of the 2 missing airmen, the radar operator and the pilot, and the pilot's brother, his kid brother, actually had the original Air Defense Command and Air Force documents sent to the family. Do you believe that? After all those years, he kept them in his shoebox in his attic. And he made copies and gave me the original telegrams and letters from Tyndall Air Force Base. And then he told me where the memorial was, the Air Force Memorial at the cemetery in Ocala, Florida, and I went and I found it. And I put all of this information into my first book, because this happened right at the high point when the crap hit the fan of Flatwoods. When you look at that map, see all those sightings there, Dave? This jet disappeared right in the middle of it. Then there was another jet accident. It was just a lot of stuff was going on in that night, and this is why it took so long to piece all of this together. But in the long run, when the documents came out for my two guys that were missing, it was even worse than I could imagined. The story looked like it was made up by the Three Stooges. And when I contacted Stanton Friedman about this, he said, Frank, there was a lot of stuff going on that night. One hand didn't know what the other hand was doing. Everybody was panicking. You have damaged craft going down. You have missing jets. You got to come up with something fast. You got to satisfy the family. The family wasn't contacted until 3 days later that their sons were missing in action. And this is over American territory. And there was just no explanations whatsoever. And then I started finding out it was all blamed on a routine weather training mission, which was a bunch of malarkey, but that's a whole other thing by itself. But the whole bottom line is, Dave, there was so much covered up. What took the Air Force a day to 2 days to cover up took me over 22 years to uncover, because it was like every corner you turned, there was another cover-up. Then you would flip that rock over, and you would find something else and something else. So it's ongoing. This will probably be a lifelong thing, because there may be viewers that hear me tonight on your show who are going to contact me. And that's how it goes. A couple of years ago, I had a fresh witness I never even knew anything about, had got a copy of my book for Christmas and read it and contacted me. So it's always stuff always going on like that. I just got another one last week. If I had to update my book, it'd be in and out of print 100 times, because every time I turn around, more information, Dave. Because the people aren't scared anymore. And once somebody goes out and they make an effort and they start showing the evidence, everybody else kind of follows along.
We had first heard the term Foo Fighters, not from the band recently. Dave Grohl does know how to rock, but in World War II, Foo Fighters were the technical name for strange occurrences in the skies of craft, namely UFOs. And the pilots came up with the nickname Foo Fighters for them.
Fire. It was fire.
Yeah.
German fire.
And I didn't know, just by listening to you, and this brings up Lisa's question, that Foo Fighters were in the United States at that time as well.
They were seen all over the world, and they were also seen in Korea, too, at the same time. There were crafts. Project Blue Book covered American territories and, different locations throughout the world, not just the United States. And I actually found one incident, and Dave, this was cool, and I have another book that's sitting in the wings I haven't released yet, but it will be in the near future. But anyways, it was one incident, and this took place over Korea, where there was an American bomber that was being pummeled by flak, was being shot at from the ground, and a gigantic cigar-shaped object came out of nowhere through the clouds, and it actually flew underneath the American aircraft and protected it from the ground attack.
That is interesting.
Amazing.
That is amazing.
This stuff is out there, Dave. There is so much of it. You can live to be 1,000 years old and never research and write all of it. What I spent over 20 years on is just over a 24-hour period. I spent, now I'm up to a quarter century on just one night. So you can imagine how much is out there, Dave. You flip through the Project Blue Book stuff, there's a book within every page. That's like with Flatwoods. This story could be broken down and made into 10 different movies, 10 different segments. There was so much going on. I had to condense it all and just put it into a manner where people would understand what it was, because every chapter is a movie.
We haven't got into yet what this creature was that people were seeing. I think that's important before we get to more questions from our audience, because we need to know, what were people seeing? People say they saw some sort of robot, some sort of artificial intelligence. Other people were not sure. What, in your research, do you have people seeing in the Flatwoods area?
Well, let's start by explaining what happened. After the kids saw this thing go over, and it was a big ovoid. It was shaped like a football, and that's what touched down on the back end of that Bailey Fisher farm. Some of the kids were scared. They went home. It was dusk. It was about 7:25 a.m. that night. A bunch of the kids ran up to Kathleen May. Two of the boys in the group, that was Freddie and Eddie May. And Freddie was 11, and the older brother was Eddie. He was 13. They kind of led the way with Jean Lemon, who was a cousin of Mrs. May. They all piled into the front house saying, "Ma, something landed up on the back field." Mrs. May, she was 32 years old at the time. She had just got in from work, and her and Lemon led the way, and they went up onto the farm. The Mays' home basically borders. There's an access road where it goes up onto the back of the farm, and this is where the kids saw this thing go down. So they went up there. There was different dogs that had come up with them. There was a big neighborhood collie dog. Mrs. May, one of her kids had a dog, and then Lemon had a dog. So we have this group, in the end, of 8 witnesses. We have Jean Lemon, Kathleen May, and then we have the kids from 14 years old down to like 5, 6 years old. I found out later on, Dave, that there was actually a lot more kids that had went up there and had wagon trained and were towards the tail end of it, but they were scared to come forward because they were told to shut up. The primary people, which were the famous people that were involved in this, who were well known in history, are the 8 people from Kathleen May and the other 7 boys. They go up the path and they go through the first field. There was 3 different fields. One was a pasture, that was the first field. The second field was a gully that had a path going up to the left, bordering the woods, and the far back hilltop, that's where the boys saw this thing land, about a mile away. So they're going through this area. They open up a first metal gate. The dogs run through the area. They're looking up in the back. It's starting to get dark, and they don't see anything up in the back. A couple of the kids that went up there, like I said, a lot of them went home. And a couple of them recognized this thing. They didn't see it up there, but they hear this noise out in the field. And it's coming from the inside of the gully of the second pasture. This thing is tucked way back in the corner, and what had happened, Dave, is the craft actually moved and relocated. After it touched down, it was glowing and pulsing. Jack Davis, one of the witnesses, said you can see this thing glowing for miles. And then all of a sudden it stopped glowing. What it had done is it lifted off and it tucked itself in this little valley gully and back of some trees out to the right-hand side. The witnesses and the dogs go through this first gate. This borders the first and second field. They closed this gate up. It was kept closed for for animals up there, and they didn't want a lot of the animals escaping and running around, so they had to make sure that this gate was closed. They go up to a second gate. Now, right about this time, the big collie dog took off like a bat out of hell, and it goes charging up the path. Now, this path is about 5-6 feet wide. It's a dirt path with stone, and this is the path that they're following to go up to the far back of the farm. This is where they want to see what touched down. At this point, there's a noise coming from up ahead around the little swag, which is a bend to the left. The dog darts off ahead, and right about this time, there was some type of a mist that smelt like rotten eggs and burning sulfur. And the collie dog let out a yelp, and it was barking, yelp. It turned around and it hightailed back towards the house. Okay? They don't know what's up ahead there, so they're still moving up, Dave. Now, at this point, they hit another fence, and some of the witnesses go forward over this fence. It's basically a little wooden fence, and this is where the path area ends at the end of this, what they called it a wagon path, okay? Some of the witnesses step over this. It's about 3.5 feet high, and all it is pieces of wood nailed from pillar to post, old slats of wood. Mrs. May, Gene Lemon, Neil Nunley, Eddie May, and Ronald Shaver, they go ahead. They're walking into this, it's like a foggy mist. It starts getting a little bit heavier, and they're starting to push on. Some of them are coughing, and the rest of the kids that are lollygagging at the end of the path, they finally make it to the second fence, which is the wooden fence, and they're looking up ahead, and in the background they still hear this constant noise which sounds like the winding down of a generator. And what that actually was the craft that was relocated in the field. Mrs. May's walking up the path with Lemon. The kids are behind them. They're spread out, and Lemon is there. He's got a flashlight. Mrs. May has a flashlight, but there was still enough of light where they didn't need to put it on. And Mrs. May and Freddie told me later on when I had questioned them who actually had the light, and each one of them, Mrs. May and Gene Lemon, both had a light. And they used the light sparingly because they didn't know how long they were going to be up in the back, and once it got dark, you didn't want to have a flashlight with dead batteries because it's pretty scary up there and dangerous. So anyways, there's still enough of light, but off to the left, Dave, they heard this noise that sounded like frying bacon. And Mrs. May described this thing as very loud. And Freddie said that he heard this whining noise off to the right-hand side. To the left-hand side, there's this oak tree. It's a gigantic oak tree. It's set back about 4 feet from the path, from this dirt path. And this is the area where this fog is emanating and coming down the path, this sickening smell. They look up to the left where they hear this noise. It's like a bacon frying. Mrs. May said it was like a crackling noise. And intermittently, she also heard this thumping that she described as dropping a quarter in rhythm onto a piece of stretched canvas, which would basically be like a conga drum or a djembe drum, like a rhythm beating. They heard this coming from the tree. As her and Lemon started walking up towards the tree, they looked to the left as they got closer, and about 12 feet up in the air, they noticed two eyes. And they were right about the level of a branch. And Lemon thought it was a possum in a tree. Mrs. May didn't know what it was. You know, your mind's racing. They thought maybe it was an animal or a raccoon. And because the woods to the left were a little bit darker and it was starting to get dark, they wanted to get a better look. And that's when they flashed their flashlight up at 12 feet into the air. And that's when they got the shock of their life. It wasn't an animal on a branch. It was what was called the Flatwoods Monster. It actually generated itself and propelled itself and lifted up off of the ground. It was actually dormant and sitting. It lifted off the ground, and it was a machine. It had to weigh hundreds and hundreds of pounds. Then this thing thrusted up, came in front, moved in front of Gene Lemon, and Mrs. May told me his legs just got rubbery, scared the hell out of him. He fell over, and Mrs. May was to his right. This thing hovered. Now, I asked Mrs. May, how close were you to you, Kathleen? And she said she was the length of a small car, which is like a Volkswagen. So this thing came pretty close to her. She got a really good look at it, and it scared Lemon half to death. He went down. It passed in front of the other boy, in front of Neil Nunley, who was to the right-hand side of the path along the valley. So this thing moves in front of them, and as it's moving, Dave, it's splattering and shooting this oily substance out all over the place. And it was pretty much propelled. It was spitting and splattering this stuff, and the kids were covered in oil that were standing behind Kathleen. One of them was her son and Ron Shaver. So this thing is moving. It's making this crackling noise, and Mrs. May said it was like due to heat, and she can actually feel the heat coming off of this thing. The monster has been called the Green Monster. The reason it was called the Green Monster is it was actually reflecting the environment of the trees and the leaves and bushes around it. It was actually aluminum. It was reflecting the color. This thing had an aluminum body, and it had an ace of spades shape over the top of its head. What it actually was, Dave, was an exterior helmet. And from the head, the inside was an inner helmet.
I'm going to get you to hold on, Frank, because we are right up against a break here on Spaced Out Radio. Frank Feschino talking with us about the Flatwoods Monster. We got a bunch of your questions left, and we'll get to them. But this interesting story just keeps on going. What the hell was it, to be honest? Let's just be honest. We don't know what it was, but we're going to find out more of the Flatwoods Monster and Frank Feschino right after this on Spaced Out Radio, heading into the third and final hour. So you stay tuned. We'll be right back right after this break. Looking for a great weekend getaway this fall? Hi there, this is Dave Scott. Come on up to the heart of British Columbia for the first annual Spaced Out Radio Caribou Paracon, being held at the Spruce Hills Spa and Resort in 108 Mile Ranch, British Columbia. Speakers from all over North America are coming to discuss Bigfoot, UFOs, ghosts, and intuitiveness for the 3-day event, September 29th to October 1st. For more information, go to spacedoutradio.com and click on the Caribou Paracon banner and book your tickets today. Come to BC, where the paranormal is waiting for you.
The SOR Sightlines is a place for you to find answers to your strange experiences. Hi there, this is Mike Schmidt. If you have had an encounter with ghosts, UFOs, Bigfoot, ETs, or anything else that doesn't make sense, head to spacedoutradio.com and file a Sightlines report. All information you give is 100% confidential, and I will personally help you find the answers you need. SOR Sightlines, your answers are a click away.
Have you got your Cosmic Passport? If you need one, tune in to Cosmic Passport on Spaced Out Weekend. This is Elizabeth Anglin, ET experiencer, spirit medium, and host of Cosmic Passport. Each weekend I'll be bringing you interviews and support from other paranormal experiencers, and the best in intuitive spiritual guidance from across the globe. It's all happening starting at 9 p.m. Pacific Time, midnight Eastern, on spacedoutradio.com.
Hi there, I'm Butch Witkowski, lead investigator with Ufo Cop. On the final Monday of every month, you can listen to me and host Dave Scott on Spaced Out Radio's Strange Days. We're going to get to the heart of the matter when it comes to what's happening out there. People are seeing and experiencing things from ET contact to Bigfoot, and I want to hear about it. Your experiences are what we investigators need to help solve these unknown mysteries. So tune in at spacedoutradio.com to the final Monday of every month from Butch Witkowski's Strange Days.
This is your medium, Joanna, from Spaced Out Weekend, 2 mediums and a large.
I would love it if you would come and join us with host James Tyson every other Sunday on Spaced Out Weekend. Together, we will take your calls and your questions live. Our goal is to provide you with a positive outlook on deep questions that you may have. Questions regarding love, relationships, money, or whatever else is on your mind. Come and check us out at spacedoutradio.com.
This is Eric Markham, news editor for the Spaced Out Radio's The Encounter Online. We have put together a great team of writers and journalists from all over the world to bring you top-quality paranormal stories, from alien encounters to the latest conspiracies. You won't find any of that fake news here. True stories and top-notch reporting as we look to bring these experiences to the mainstream. The Encounter Online, only at spacedoutradio.com.
Patrolling the Pacific Northwest, we are always on the lookout for the strange and unassuming stories that real people are experiencing. Hi, I'm Vincent Zunza from Pacific North Weird. Me and Alexandra Sullivan have teamed to bring to you those odd stories that never seem to make it into the mainstream. Stories so weird that will leave you scratching your head wondering, is this real? It's as real as it gets with Pacific North Weird. You can watch our videos right here at spacedoutradio.com.
Become more intimate and interactive with Spaced Out Radio. Join our Space Travelers Club with your new membership. For $5 a month, we'll provide you with special access to the website, monthly prize draws from books to psychic readings, along with monthly newsletter, private interviews, and more. Sign up today to be part of Spaced Out Radio's experience.
Looking for a place to advertise at a very reasonable cost? Look no further than Spaced Out Radio. SpacedOutRadio.com has an advertising tab that you can click to check out our daily, weekly, and monthly packages to play on the radio, or our website including social media. From commercial spots to banners, we have it all. Check out our competitive pricing today.
Don't have time to listen to Spaced Out Radio live? Wherever you are, the car, the office, the shower, or even if you're traveling, we're right here for you. Each Spaced Out Radio show can be found on iTunes, TuneIn, and on our YouTube channel, Spaced Out Radio Show. It's the perfect way for you to catch up on our shows. For more information, just head over to our website, spacedoutradio.com, and tune in to us today.
You hear footsteps in the empty room above you. A rocking chair begins rocking by itself. Don't be afraid of the things that go bump in the night. Reach for Spirit Storybox, the iPhone app the Huffington Post UK called the only ghost hunting app you will ever need. Spirit Storybox. The spirits are telling their stories. Are you listening?
Strange creatures lurking in the night, the sounds of wood knocking in the forest, odd happenings right out of a fictional world. These are the reports I love. Hi there, this is author Ronald Murphy, and I would love it if you join me and Spaced Out Radio host Dave Scott the second Wednesday of every month on our journey into the unknown land of cryptozoology at spacedoutradio.com. From Mothman to Frogman and everything in between. Hey, they don't call me the crypto guru for nothing.
Did you know that Spaced Out Radio runs 7 days a week? Hi, it's James Tyson from Spaced Out Weekend. Every Saturday and Sunday night, starting at 9 p.m. Pacific, midnight Eastern, you can join me and my guests for some great chatter about what's going on out in the universe, or even in that dark part of the basement you really don't want to go back into. Well, let's find the answers to your experiences together. So come on up to Uncle Jimbo's cabin on the weekend. For more information, look us up at spacedoutradio.com.
The views and opinions expressed by tonight's guest and topic of discussion do not necessarily represent the official policy or position of Spaced Out Radio, Spaced Out Weekend, Spaced Out Radio Limited, its hosts, syndicated carriers, or anyone associated with this broadcast. You're listening to Spaced Out Radio with Dave Scott. Follow Dave on Twitter at Spaced Out Radio and hashtag Spaced Out Radio, and on Facebook, Spaced Out Radio Show. Now, back to the program.
A child grew up too fast, went running wild. Now we don't know who to pray to anymore.
Welcome back to the final hour of Spaced Out Radio tonight. I am your host, Dave Scott. Great to have you with us. Thank you so much for tuning us on in. We really do appreciate it. Tomorrow night, we have David Adair on the program. Now, I may be hosting, or Eric Markham may be hosting, one of the two. I'm heading down to the coast in the morning. I'm only going to get about 4 hours sleep before I got to rush on out of here to go watch my daughter get ready for her prom and get some nice photos taken. She's going to look so beautiful. I'm so proud of her. She's an A student, too, going to university to get her English degree in the fall. I'm so excited for her. But that's what I'm doing. So I'm hoping I will be back for showtime. If not, Eric Markham will be here at spacedoutradio.com starting at 9 p.m. Pacific, midnight Eastern time. So make sure you're all here as well, because I want to see you here. If you want to follow us on terrestrial radio, you can do so on WQEE 99 Rock the Key down in Noonan, Georgia, home of The Walking Dead. We are live as well on the United Public Radio Network on 107.7 FM in New Orleans and over 160 countries around the world. Great to have you with us as well. We're live on KTLK, The Fringe FM, Renegade Talk Radio out of Las Vegas. And if you're listening in on Revolution Radio, remember the Double R Machine is a donation station financed by you, the valued listener. Head on over to freedomslips.com and donate today. Bill Cardwell has set the password for tonight in the SOR Space Travelers Club. Banjulele. Banjulele is your password. Make sure you use it wisely, Space Travelers, as Bill sets a password each and every night right here on the mighty SOR. Now, if you want to follow us on social media, you can do so on Twitter at Spaced Out Radio. You can use the hashtag Spaced Out Radio to connect with me live during the show as well. Give our Facebook page a like, Spaced Out Radio Show. On Instagram, follow me at Dave Scott, SOR. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, Spaced Out Radio Show. Tune us in on TuneIn. Download this show and others on iTunes. Our website is spacedoutradio.com, where we have a plethora of features for you, including going to our Spaced Out Radio store, picking up a t-shirt, poster, swag like stickers, and you can pick up VIP tickets for our first annual Spaced Out Radio Caribou Paracon, September 29th to October 1st in beautiful 108 Mile Ranch, British Columbia. Tickets are 10% off until July 31st. Come hang out with the weirdos, man, because I'm a weirdo, and I want to see you here. We got a great weekend of paranormal tributes going on, and I want you here. And I'm going to release a lineup very, very soon. Now, you can also check out the Encounter online and join the SOR Space Travelers Club for as low as $5 a month. We've been talking the Flatwoods Monster all night with Frank Feschino. What an amazing story, Frank. I want to say thank you for sharing this with our audience, because for the most of us, we'd never heard of this before. It's been so covered up over the last few decades. So thank you so much for bringing this to our attention and keeping this story alive.
Glad to be here tonight, Dave.
Now, right before we went to break, we started talking about what this monster was. I would love for you to go into the encounter that followed up with a black and white drawing, which was the first real picture of what the public saw of this thing.
Well, I'll tell you from my personal experience, I had seen this drawing in the Reader's Digest book, and like I said, all those Frank Edward books and those sorts of books from the 60s and 70s. When I was researching this, Dave, back years ago, people don't realize the lack of internet. I didn't have internet, so I did everything by foot, running to libraries, looking stuff up on microfilm. And that's 99% of what you see on the internet today, of all the newspaper articles and the photographs of the witnesses. That's everything I dug up. That just shotgun around the world. I spent millions of hours in libraries on microfilm. I have probably every newspaper article ever printed on Earth about the Flatwoods case. So all those articles you see on the internet were all mine. That's what I dug out when I would make trips up north from Florida, I was just digging through all the libraries. I had a couple friends I ran around with over the years, and that's what we would do, just make trips up there for a week, 2 weeks, just hitting libraries. In between, if we were lucky enough to get a witness, Mrs. May always knew my contact number, and she would call me and tell me who to talk to or where to go, or here's a lead for you. So that's what I did for several years. Sitting down with Mrs. May, she was the one that made me aware that the monster didn't look like that stupid drawing that's been seen from 1952 all the way up into the early 90s. So you're talking about 40 years to the point when I started into it after the fact. So I would sit down with her, and being an illustrator, I would do police-style renderings. And then I would come home from her descriptions, and I would do an upgraded sketch. And sometimes I would mail them to Mrs. May, or I would make a trip up there. Then I got put in touch with her son. Then I had talked to different witnesses. And in the long run, I found out this thing was not as was reported through the press in 1952 as a monster wearing a cloaked dress with arms and claws with that big thing over its head, the Ace of Spades covering, which looked like a big hood. And when you look at the original drawing, the thing that really blew the people away is that this thing floated. And if you look at the original drawings, Dave, you could see there's a drop cast shadow in the original black and white drawing. And what had come about with this whole thing is there was a talk show back in 1952 called We the People. And it was the talk show in its day. And, you know, kind of like the Oprah show or the Phil Donahue show, you know, this was the talk show of the day. It would have celebrities on the show, and then it would have just average American folk, and they would meet and talk with the celebrities, and they would talk about something that happened in their lives that was, you know, a moving story. And the people in Flatwoods got contacted by this talk show. And Mrs. May and Gene Lemon, her cousin, and Ailey Stewart Jr., who was the reporter, who was the Johnny on the spot who broke the story, and I went to North Carolina and I interviewed him. I actually stayed at his house for a few days and interviewed him. And they went to New York, and they went into the NBC studios, and at this point, the story had broken, and it was actually on the front page of the New York Daily News. It was in the Washington papers. It was from coast to coast. It had appeared in parts of Europe, and it was in Italy. So the story was pretty well known at this point, and it was broadcast throughout radio. And the story became so popular within the first week that somebody had even written a song that was aired on a country western station about the Flatwoods Monster. So it got pretty big real quick. And what happened is when the witnesses and the newspaper reporter got to New York, they sat in off camera to the side, and a sketch artist came out, and he sat down with the witnesses, and Mrs. May and Gene Lemon gave their rendition, their point of view of what this thing looked like. Now, where the artist screwed up is he took everything literally. He hash-banged this thing out real quick. Mrs. May was trying to describe the pipes, and Gene Lemon was describing the pipes of the lower torso on this machine, and what it was is it flared out like a rocket, a booster rocket. And there were pipes about as thick as your arm that went around the lower circumference around this craft. That was part of the propulsion system that lifted this thing up, and that's what the witnesses were smelling, was the gas that this thing was emitting. Well, Mrs. May's talking to the artist, and a housewife in Central West Virginia back in 1952 was trying to describe this lack of better words, an extraterrestrial spacecraft or hovercraft. She had no idea what this thing was. All she knows is that she saw this thing, and she's trying to give a description of it. And the closest that she can give the description of these pipes is it said that the rolls of these pipes reminded her of the hanging drapes and the pleats and her curtains in her living room. Do you understand what I mean? The
totally.
Rolling, okay? So the artist draws this thing wearing drapes, wearing a dress. You know, he had the, I don't know, I understood when I sat down with the witnesses, this guy, I don't know what his deal was, Dave, but he completely botched it up. And when Mrs. May was trying to describe these small little things that were seen off of the shoulder, and some of them, the witness described them looking like little fingers or hands. When I talked to Freddie May, Freddie said they looked like antenna to him, and they were moving like forward and backwards. They may have been some type of a receiving device. I don't know. I'm just reporting what was told to me correctly. And what the artist did is he drew these antenna devices on the plane of the shoulders into big arms and scary claws. And then over the top of its head, what the witnesses were describing was this black Ace of Spades helmet with an inner helmet. The inner helmet was red in color. And Freddie, one day I went up there and we were talking and we were having lunch, and he likened the Flatwoods Monster's head area to like looking in the cockpit of a fighter jet, like seeing a fighter pilot sitting inside the canopy. Okay, you got that? What the red face and head actually were an inner helmet, and it had no eyes. Mrs. May and Freddie told me that these eyes were actually portholes, and this was something behind looking out. The beams that shot out from the eye-opening areas weren't laser beams, you know, like from a Buck Rogers ray gun or something corny like that. This thing was dormant, and it sat dormant. Mrs. May's famous quote to the press is she said it lit up like a Christmas tree. What this thing was, Dave, was a craft, and it was lit up from the inside. It's like if you go into your automobile at night, you put your key in the ignition and you turn it, all your dashboard lights come on, the lights come on, and everything comes to life. That's what Mrs. May said happened when she saw this thing. It reacted to the flashlight from Lemon and her shooting a beam on its head, and this whole thing lit up from the inside. It's like the key was turned, this thing lifted up, propelled itself in front of the witnesses, and the beam shot out. They were actually light from the inside being forced out of these portholes. And Mrs. May said it was like an inner helmet. And Freddie described the whole helmet area. He said the portion over the top came to an Ace of Spades point. And he said there was a shield barrier, like a big piece of glass or plexiglass in front of it. That's why he likened it to if you were standing in front of a fighter jet looking into the cockpit. The canopy was actually the helmet. The pilot was inside, and this thing, which Freddie told me it was mechanical, and from what he saw, it led him to believe there was actually something inside of it because it reacted, and there were portholes where something was inside there where it could see. This thing moved in front of the witnesses. It was strong enough, the propulsion system, where it was actually turning over rocks and blowing the dirt around the area. It was leaking oil where it was sitting. Colonel Levitt told me there was a big puddle of oil, and some of the oil had also splattered throughout the woods. As this moved in front of the group, it went off to the path and proceeded down the slope, and it went out across the field back to where the craft was sitting. Remember earlier I told you it relocated into the gully of the farm? What it did is there were actually two sets of tracks. One set of two tracks. One was coming from the craft area, and it followed it back through, like following your footprints through the snow back into the woods. That is what was referred to as the skid marks. They were not skid marks whatsoever. What they were these the area where the propulsion system had pushed the grass down and turned the rocks over. Ailey Stewart, the reporter who I interviewed, was up there, the first one on the spot. After the West Virginia National Guard troops had left, actually Stewart was up there in the morning, and he told me he was the first one to see the scarred landscape. And he walked through the field, and he said that the tracks were about 4 feet wide. And that's how we could kind of gauge how wide this thing was at the base, this machine. And a cross-reference, I asked Freddie on location, how big was it? And he told me it was about 4 feet at the base, and they could judge how wide it was by the width of the path. And they can judge the height of it because when it lifted up, Mrs. May told me it was about 1 foot to 1.5 feet off the ground when it hovered in front of her. There was a tree there. There was a low-hanging tree branch, and as it came out over the path, it actually dipped down towards the ground, towards the gully of the field. And I'm remembering stories and pieces from all these different witnesses, and Colonel Levitt told me that that branch, when it came down towards the ground from over 10 foot high to the point, he said you can actually reach up and touch that branch over to the right of the path. But he's told me there wasn't much room for this thing to have gotten out. It must have barely just cleared that branch, and the whole back part of that area of the woods and the dirt and everything was splattered with oil. And we know there was more oil in the back because Mrs. May told me a story that floored me, is that when this happened, Dave, there were reporters there from all over the United States. And there was one pair of particular reporters who were very pushy with her. And when they went up there the first day, they told her they were reporters from Clarksburg, West Virginia, which is north of Braxton County and Flatwoods. They came back the next day and they were in her face and they were being a pain in the ass about it and real pushy. And Mrs. May is just getting overwhelmed by the curious sightseers. There's hundreds of people up there. They're running around the field. They're trying to interview Mrs. May. They're trying to track down the witnesses. It was just like a circus up there, just everything going on hitting this town at once. These guys came back the following day, and they spoke to Mrs. May, and they wanted to actually scrape the oil out of her little uniform that was covered with oil, and they took some type of a tool and scraped it off and put it in an envelope. And I said, Mrs. May, whatever happened to the your uniform? She said she just discarded it. She said it was stained anyways. I couldn't wear it. It was useless. But these guys kept this, and they went onto the field, and Freddie assisted Mrs. May, his mom. And when they went into the field, Mrs. May gave the layout of what she had seen, and they had seen all of these marks. Well, Mrs. May said that the guys admitted to her that they were from the government because they wanted some answers, and Mrs. May wouldn't talk to them. So finally, she said, Frank, they came out and they told me they were from Washington, and it was just a cover-up. When they were there the day before, they were posing as newspaper reporters, which they were not. And because she was getting bombarded with requests for interviews, and she had a telephone, which, by the way, was a party phone back then, I found out. Mrs. May had a good memory. She even told me your old phone number. I got it here in my notes someplace, Dave. But anyways, what happened is Mrs. May said these guys told her they were from Washington. And she said they had on $1,000 suits. These guys were dressed up to the teeth. They did not fit into Braxton County and the culture up there. These guys were like really overdone. She said she pointed to the area where the encounter happened. They were standing out in the field. Freddie was hanging around with her, and they were talking. And everybody else kind of backed off away from them. She said one guy went up, and she said he had a beautiful suit on, and he had one, you know, those 1950s hats, Dave? I forget what you call them. They look like the gangster hats. He walked from the
fedoras,
area.
like a fedora?
Yeah. Okay. He walked into the area where the tree was. He went up the slope. He went to the dirt path, and he walked out behind the area of the tree where the encounter occurred. And Mrs. May said she stayed down by the fence area towards, you know, the area of the gully field, talking with Freddie and this other guy from Washington. And he was asking her questions. And she says a little bit while later, this fella came back out of the woods, and he walked up to his assistant, and he walked up to Freddie and Kathleen. And Mrs. May said, and I remember this because it was funny, Dave, I was actually sitting in her apartment interviewing her during this. And she was sitting in her big easy chair, and I was sitting over to her left. And she put her arms out to her side, and she says, when this guy came back, she said, he held his arms out, and he was dripping oil. And he was marked. She said he looked like a zebra. And I said, what do you mean, Mrs. May, he looked like a zebra? She said, because the oil had splattered so much from the Flatwoods craft, from the creature, it was splattered throughout the branches. And when this guy walked through, his beautiful suit got ruined. It was light in color, like a beige. And she said there were thousands of marks of oil all over it, and he was dripping oil. And he turned and he looked at his assistant, and he said, I wonder what Ed's going to think when he sees this. And Mrs. May said to me, she says, I don't know who Ed was. Well, I took a little bit deeper look into this, and Edward Ruppelt was the head of Project Blue Book back in 1952 at the time of the Flatwoods Monster incident. He was the head chief of the UFO project. And that is just an educated guess, what the intelligence agent said. And then they took everything they got from the stuff from Mrs. May, all the scrapings and all of that, and they split, and they left, and Mrs. May never saw him again. I asked Colonel Levitt of all the pieces that he sent to Washington, whatever happened. He says the Air Force never contacts. He says he didn't hear anything from them. So everything was pretty much at a dead end right at that point, and they never heard anything else.
That's pretty intense. So how does this lead down to the Franktown incident?
What had happened is, well, getting back to the Flatwoods, a description of the monster, Dave, okay? We know it was mechanical. Freddie May, when I interviewed him out in the field, he said it was mechanical. It was not alive. Maybe inside the thing there could have been something that was alive. What I saw was either a small spaceship or suit of some kind, something it was wearing. It was mechanical. So, and then from his description and Mrs. May's descriptions of the inside of this, it wasn't actually a red face. It was this helmet with the porthole eyes. And Mrs. May said that the head was turning. There was like a collar, a big, thick collar, and the head was pivoting on it, looking out across the field So the beams were wavering. It was like it was looking in the field for something, and then that's when it shot over into that direction. So I have these drawings and illustrations from the witnesses, and if you look at the mechanical end of it, what it actually was, the original bears a slight resemblance, except it's not cloth. It's all metal. Take off the arms and claws, turn all the cloth into steel or metallic object, and you have a hovercraft. And that's what Freddie believed it was. That's what Mrs. May believed it was, and all the other witnesses that I talked to. And I met most of them. A lot of them have passed away, but I met most of them over the years, Dave. And this thing was definitely mechanical. When Mrs. May was on the TV show 1 week later, that's where the drawing was put on public television, and that's what everybody saw. Well, I backtracked a little bit from that TV show, and I actually found out that there was an article that was written in a Charleston paper, and this Charleston, West Virginia paper was accompanied with the credit to who gave the information, and it was actually Ailey Stewart Jr., who I interviewed. So the first description of the Braxton County Monster being was in the Charleston Daily Mail, and that was on the 14th, just a couple days after the incident. And then we have, on Monday the 15th, this is when the story really broke wide open and shotgun around the United States on the press wires. We have the article, which is special to the Gazette, and that was by Ailey Stewart Jr., and it was described 5 days before the incorrect television show drawing. It was actually described in the Charleston article by Stewart by interviewing the witnesses, because he was the first one to interview him the following morning. It looked like the Flatwoods Monster looked like a mechanical man wearing green armor. So you see, it went from the main source to the reporter who reported it correctly. And that was in the paper within a couple days. Everybody forgot about that story. So that corroborates all my research showing that it was done correctly in the first place with Stewart, the witnesses, and then what screwed it up was that stupid talk show. So there's the backup of the story, and there's a full-blown article here, how the thing had a Ace of Spades cowl over its head. It looked like a mechanical man, was 10 feet tall, 4 foot wide, and had a blood-red face. That was the inner helmet area. It was all right there in black and white, and everybody forgot about it, Dave. But what happened is the story really blasted off after it went on television, and for over 40 years, that's what the drawing that was seen. When internet came into play and I started interviewing and coming out with all my drawings, and they were shotgun across the internet, I was getting calls from Japan and emails from Japan like crazy, because the Flatwoods Monster in Japan is an icon. There's hundreds of toys and dolls made about the Flatwoods Monster in Japan, the land of monsters, Godzilla, all that type of the likes of the monsters. And all the Japanese folk wanted to know, why does it look like a rocket ship now? All their toys are wrong. And their descriptions of the monster are wrong. I said, because that's the way that it was described originally, as looking like a mechanical man with a booster rocket and the lower portion. So back to your original question, Dave, how does the Frametown incident tie into this? Frametown's about 17 miles away from Flatwoods. I was able to go in and pull out some of the original newspaper articles from the archives, and I actually tracked the Flatwoods Monster craft after it took off at a Bailey Fisher farm, It actually followed the river and crashed 17 miles away in this area called Frametown. This is the same town that my cousin owned property where the crop circles were seen. Okay, he's since passed on. But back then, there was, very desolate, isolated area. There was a young couple, they were from New York, and they had went to Ohio, and they were sightseeing and coming on the way back home to go to New York. They were driving through about 8 o'clock on September 13th. Now, this is about 24 hours right after the Flatwoods incident. The Flatwoods incident had not made it into the press yet. All the other UFO sightings had made it into the press, but the outsiders didn't know about Flatwoods, which is a key point here, okay? Because what happened shortly after, I was able to piece back into it. This couple was driving through Frametown, and their car, without any warning, just stalled, Dave, on the side of the road. The battery was fairly new in the car, and the couple was George and Edith Snatowski, and they were traveling with their baby. And the baby was just over a year old, and back then they had no baby car seats. There was a crib that was in the back seat. Now, these early 1950s cars, they were like boats. They were like SUVs, except low to the ground. And the baby is in the back seat and starts carrying on, because as the car coasts over to the side of the road, this sulfur smell starts coming from the woods into the area off-road where this George Snatowski's car is broken down. Well, George and Edith are sitting in the car, the baby's starting to carry on, and this area's starting to fill up with this smell. George thought it was a chemical factory because of the sulfur. He thought there was some type of a factory where there was a fire nearby or an exhaust. He gets out of the car, and he starts walking up into a wooded area, and he sees out in the distance, he sees this pulsating purple light. This was the same type of light and same shaped craft that Mrs. May described to me 40 years later. Mrs. May told me when she was walking up onto the farm, she could see out in the distance this purplish flare that would emanate and blast. She could see it way out in the distance, and she saw the farm was lit up, and then it would get darker again because it was dusk. Snatowski described the same thing to me and in an article that was written in July 1955 in a magazine. It was called Mail Magazine. It was like an adventure magazine, sporting, outdoorsman, and it would tell war stories. Well, anyways, George Snatowski's story was first published in that magazine in 1955. I tracked him down in New York, and I talked to him on the phone. And basically, he told me everything that was in that article was true. He didn't want to go public with it because of his job. He didn't want to get into it any further, but he talked to me. He said everything was absolutely true in this story. What he didn't realize is there was a connection back to Flatwoods with this whole thing. When George Snatowski started walking out into the wooded area towards this pulsing light, he started getting electrical shocks, like pinpricks going through his body, and it started affecting him. He's inhaling all of this gas. He drops down onto his knee, and he starts vomiting from inhaling this stuff, and he's messed up. His equilibrium is off. As he gets up to turn back away from this light that's pulsating, and he said it was like bouncing up and down, moving up and down. It wasn't stationary, and it looked like a phosphorus lamp with a purple exterior glow, almost like a fluorescent light. As he's walking back towards the car, his wife starts freaking out and going goddamn crazy, Dave, and she's scared out of her mind. She's screaming like Fay Ray when she saw King Kong. He turns around and she's screaming, George, turn around, look out, what's behind you? And he turns around, and off to the side of the wooded area where it meets the road, this thing had come out of the woods, and it was actually following George back to the car. And it was described as being a good 9 foot tall. I had asked Natowski what the head looked like and the basics of it, a little bit more than what was written in that magazine article. And the way that I could understand it, Dave, it was the Flatwoods Monster with the upper portion of its suit off, because what he saw was this thing hovering towards him. And like in Flatwoods, when the witnesses got sick from the inhalation, from the gas, and this sulfur smell, he smelled the same thing. He saw the Flatwoods Monster standing in its spacesuit. From the waist up, he saw the flesh, the monster in the flesh. From the waist down, it was standing in this propulsion machine, which he described as one big solid mass, and it had the pipes, and that's where the gas was shooting out. He saw the suit removed from the waist up to the top of the head. This thing, he said, had long, spindly arms, and it was a good 9 feet tall. It's hovering just off behind him, and it starts following him. He freaks out. The wife's in the car. She had grabbed the baby up out of the crib from the back seat. He jumped back into the car, and what he did is he had some type of a big hunting knife, and he kept it in the glove box. Now, you have to remember these early 1950s cars, they were gigantic. There was a lot of floorboard space. The baby is in the arms of its mother. He takes his wife and the baby, and he pushes her down on the floor underneath the glove box where the hump of the transmission would be. And, that whole area of the car. He gets down, and he's laying on top of them, and he's protecting them. He's got this big, giant hunting knife. This thing comes up towards the car. He had rolled the windows up because this whole area is being gassed out by this sulfur smell. He looks down. What the thing actually did is it circled around the car. So this whole area is all gassed up. He looks up after a couple minutes, and this is probably one of the scariest things I ever heard in my life. As he looked up over the dashboard of the car, looked through the windshield out in front, this thing was standing there, or actually hovering there, looking down inside of the car. And it was some type of reptilian-looking creature. He described the arms as being long and skinny and spindly, and they were disjointed. The forearms were actually a little bit longer, and he said there were 2 fingers on the end. There was no thumb and only 2 digits, and they were like a Y. And this thing was standing there looking at him. It didn't make any harmful gestures towards the guy, but it was just looking inside, and it scared the hell out of him. And it reached down, and it touched the hood of the car, and it actually burnt through the paint into the primer. The skin actually burned into the metal. It lifted its hand back off, it turned around, and it went back into the woods. Now, his wife and the baby are hysterical. He's freaking out. He said his heart was pounding like a sledge, and he also made the quote, "If ever there was a time I was praying in my life, I was praying at this point," because it scared the hell out of him. This reptilian thing floated back away from the car. It went into the woods, and it disappeared. A few minutes later, when he had looked back up over the dashboard, he saw this light from the UFO had lifted above the tree lines, and it started swinging in a pendulum motion, which back in that era, there was a lot of reports of that type of a propulsion where it was swinging like a pendulum. He said it swung back and forth, and then it took off like a bat out of hell and disappeared into the sky. He said instinctively what he tried doing next is try to get the hell out of there. And this time when he turned the ignition on the car, it started right up. And they left. They drove back in towards the Sutton area, and they went to a truck stop down in town. And they went into the restaurant, and they just chilled out, and they hung out there for the night. And I knew a lot of this from reading the article. Snitowski on the telephone told me a little bit more, and Dave, that's basically what I have, is this thing looked like a reptilian, some type of a snake-looking thing with had some type of a teeth in the front. But the thing that was the most catchy, he said it had like a bloated body, like the lower torso of it, where he could see, which would basically be like your navel area and your hips up is what he saw. It was standing in the lower half of the craft. And the arms stood out, and especially the two fingers. And when it touched the hood of the car, it burned it. So quite a scary story there.
No kidding. No kidding. Do you mind if we get to some questions from our audience?
Yeah, let's shoot.
All right, this one comes from Stardust Man over in the Revolution Radio chat room. He's been waiting a while. He says, do you think that just maybe that the Black Shadow government may have been doing some testing and this was some sort of test that went wrong?
I don't think so, because you're talking 23 hours of UFO sightings, missing pilots, UFOs crashed all over the place. This was during the shoot-down orders. What did go crazy is somebody started shooting at UFOs, and all you need is a couple pilots starting to shoot. And the interesting part, Dave, is if your viewers look at my map, which is on my website, or if you just Google Flatwoods Monster Map or Master Map, the three mid-Atlantic objects, when I brought the flight path trajectories all the way to the apex, they intersected over the no-fly zone, the Air Defense Identification Zone, ADIZ, and that's where they all pinpointed. That's where these things were taken out. They went inland, 1, 2, 3. Here's the key point. The first object that came in flew southwest. It went through several states, and it was making a beeline towards the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. The second UFO that came in damaged with pieces and in flames flew up in the opposite direction, and it headed northwest, and it was flying into the direction of Wheeling, where Wright-Patterson Air Force Base is. The third object that came in is the one that passed over Flatwoods. When that passed over Flatwoods and it went right over the Capitol and it proceeded west, there was actually a dozen UFOs that descended out of the sky, formed an aerial perimeter around the damaged object, and thousands of people in Washington, D.C. were out. It was hot, no air conditioning. They're out driving around in their convertibles, walking their dogs, walking their kids in strollers through the Washington, Virginia area, and they look up and they see a dozen UFOs flying in formation. They circled the Flatwoods Monster damaged craft, and they followed it west, Dave, like blockers on a football field protecting their runner as he's making a breakaway. That's what they actually did. And all of this information was right in Project Blue Book. All that had to be done was put into some type of cohesive manner where we can figure out what were they all doing. And once I made the giant map and I put all the pieces together, and I work with military people, and I didn't actually figure this out, Dave. The military people I work with figured it out. Because I understand now, but back in the day, one particular guy, he stood there and he went, "Holy crap, Frank, do you understand what you have here?" He said, "We think like them." He said, because what they did here was a search and rescue mission, and they were protecting their damaged craft, and they had a lot of balls. They did not care. They got shot down. One was putting pressure and went into the direction. Now, can you imagine? It flew through the no-fly zone of Oak Ridge National Laboratory. That wasn't made public, but it's in Project Blue Book. Then I followed the newspaper articles, and I followed the flight path trajectory off the East Coast. That flew towards Tennessee. The other one flew up towards Dayton, and the third one came over Washington, D.C. When the third one came over Washington, D.C., that is where it should have been intercepted and taken down. But what are you going to do if you're the president sitting in Washington and you know these things are flying all over around you? Mr. President, one's heading towards Wright Pat. By the way, the other one's heading down south, and that's going towards Oak Ridge. God forbid it does a kamikaze into there. What do you want to do? The third one's coming over D.C. and it's flying over our heads now. We're going to intercept it and take it down? Well, what are you going to do if it goes down and it lands in the front lawn of the White House? So when this thing, and we all timed it by the documentation in Blue Book, when this third craft, which was the damaged Flatwoods craft, which was the most damaged craft, when it passed over Washington, Dave, the other two turned away from their targets and redirected. One down in Tennessee landed in Arcadia, and it set off flares, and there were search and rescue teams from the local fire departments that went over there because it was seen by witnesses where it touched down. The other one redirected, and it was up near Dayton, and it's not supposed to be flying around up by Wright Pat either. What it did is it turned and went north into the Wheeling, West Virginia area and nearly collided with a passenger plane. What these objects did is once they redirected, when it was the third object passed over safe, they started following. Now, if you look at the map, Dave, you could see, if you look close, what they were actually doing was following the flight corridors throughout West Virginia. They were following the beacons. And eventually, the Flatwoods Monster craft crashed a little while later, not like the government's explanation that it was a meteor seen for a few seconds. This thing took about 20 minutes to fly over Washington, 200 miles west. If it was a meteor, it would have been a matter of seconds. So that was the cover story. Let's say it was a meteor. The public won't know any different, and they really didn't. Some of the original investigators couldn't figure out, and they were questioning what was going on. But back in the day, Project Blue Book was not declassified yet, Dave, so they didn't have the luxury of going through all these reports like I did. And in the long run, is when the Flatwoods craft went down, all the other objects flew into the Flatwoods area, and they were on a mission to find us, a search and rescue mission. That's what the original Gray Barker, who was the original investigator, Gray Barker was pulling his hair out, and he even said in one of his books he could not figure out why there were so many descriptions of different of UFOs when there was only said to be one craft that went down. He didn't realize they were coming in looking for it. And I go into explicit detail, Dave, and in the back of my book, I have a gigantic setup with all the breakdowns and the locations, and I know where every single location was where these things touched down. On top of it were puddle jumping, and they eventually moved out of the United States. So what happened is after the Flatwoods craft went down on the Fisher farm, it took off It actually circled around the farm. There were witnesses that saw it. It followed a flight path along the river, flew low level, crashed in the mountains of Frametown. It was seen, so it was actually on Earth for about 24 hours. When it was seen by the Satowski family a day later, it was picked up. We don't know where the craft went, Dave. We don't know where it went. We don't know if it got picked up by the other craft or if the government got it. We have no idea what happened to it. But a lot of people over the years at book signings have brought up to me, Frank, there was probably more than one of these creatures on board. Usually when you have a craft like that size, there usually isn't one. So what happened to them? So if there were more beings on board, where are they? What happened to everybody? There's still questions that we don't know, but we have the backbone of the story of this, Dave, where we could figure out what actually happened. And there were other sightings, and there was another being that was seen up in the area of Wheeling. They call the Bashful Billy, and that's a whole other story within itself of another being that was found dead. So we have the one in Flatwoods, we have one in Wheeling, and we have the one down in Arcadia near Oak Ridge National Laboratory where that craft set off a search party. And it's all documented. This stuff is in Blue Book. It's in local newspapers. I have eyewitness testimony, and it's just all pieced together here. But the backbone of the story is that master map, Dave. That tells the whole story right there.
We only have about 2.5 minutes left with you tonight, Frank, and I want to say thank you on behalf of our audience for filling us in. This creature is incredible. Are there still reports coming through on it, or is it one of those stories that is starting to die down as the population ages?
As far as the story, it's bigger than ever. This seems to have been an isolated incident. And it seems like after the Flatwoods case, you didn't get a hell of a lot of sightings of alien reports and anything to this magnitude with this many sightings, Dave. I think the Air Force laid back because when you start shooting at stuff, the things aren't going to go land in the water. They're going to come inland. And they were shot off the coast. And that's another thing I get into in the book. A lot of people questioned the United States Air Force had rocket-bearing craft back then with computers on board. We had the Saberjet, the F-94C Starfire, and then the Navy had Cutlass. So we had rocket-bearing jets then, and what a hell of a surprise that would have been with shooting bullets at UFOs, and they would know to drop off at a trajectory, and then all of a sudden you're firing rockets at these UFOs. I thought they were caught off guard. That's what I believe. And they got something happened with their field, however these things run, and these rockets interrupted it. And if you get thousands of rockets firing at UFOs, now this is during the shoot-down order, most UFOs seen in history. All of these flight path trajectories at Apex was directly across from Washington in a no-fly zone. And the best jets that are in the military on guard are always around the Capitol. So the Capitol had the best jets available to go up to protect.
Frank, please let everybody... Frank, I got to cut it short here. Please let everybody know where they can find your book, my friend.
It's flatwoodsmonster.com. You can go on there and you click on the cover of the book. It's the updated and revised edition, Dave. And I bring her straight to the publisher, and you can get it through there. And there, like I said earlier, I have a lot of the fighter pilot incidents and statistics on my website. It's quite big, so you're going to have fun looking at it.
I know we got you one sale tonight because Gloria already said she picked hers up during this show. She's so amazed. Frank Feschino, thank you so much for being on Spaced Out Radio. You hold on. I got to wrap this thing up. If you're listening in the background, you hear Mr. Ron Bumblefoot THAL, our resident guitar god. Bumblefoot rocks us in and out of every show as the official music of Spaced Out Radio. Tomorrow night, 9 p.m. Pacific, midnight Eastern Time, we have David Adair coming on the show. I may be here to host it. The preacher, Eric Markham, may be here to host it. We may do it together. Maybe we'll just turn it over to Eric. Don't know. I got to go attend my daughter's prom. I plan on having fun with that and seeing how beautiful my baby girl looks on her prom night. It's going to be fun. So I may be here, I may not. We want to thank everyone on our team. Everett Themer, Eric Markham from The Encounter Online, Jolene Lammers, Web Design, Kim Gandy, Director of Business Development, Thomas McGowan in Sales, Bob Davis, our intro voice, Catherine James, Social Media, and our Paracon Coordinator, Lana Scott. That is your Spaced Out Radio team. Thank you so much for being with us, all of you in the audience, because we can't do it without you. We just can't. That's not the way it works around here. And I want to say thank you to everyone who shares our shows, spreads them around, tells their friends, because together, my friends, we own the night. We'll talk to you in 21 hours from now. Mr. Bumblefoot, take us home.